Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the velvet-draped gloom of old royal halls, where paintings stare back at you with eyes a little too close together, chins that could crush walnuts, and eyebrows that clearly got the memo to meet in the middle. You're not in a horror story, though honestly, you could have fooled me. You're in Europe's royal past. And tonight's sleepy little stroll takes US into the quietly disturbing world of royal inbreeding. You settle into a creaky chair in a long corridor of ancestral portraits. The air smells like beeswax and secrets. Your footsteps echo just a little too loudly because nearly every ruler on these walls is related to the next, and the next, and, oh look, married to their niece. Again, this isn't just a tale of over-the-top powdered wigs and ceremonial swords. It's about what happens when kings and queens play matchmaker with a family tree shaped more like a pretzel than a pine. And yes, it's as alarming as it sounds. You'll meet a Spanish king who couldn't chew his food, a Russian prince whose knee scrape nearly toppled an empire, and a handful of royals who mumbled through madness while Europe just nodded along. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where and when we're falling asleep together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pass the first portrait stern, candlelit, and vaguely fish-like. This is Philip IV of Spain, looking pensive, or perhaps just tired. The line of his jaw is more sloped than angle, and his eyes are set like distant cousins, close, but awkwardly far apart. That's not an accident. He's one of many Habsburgs, the most notoriously inbred royal family in Europe. And we're just getting started. The halls of European royalty, for centuries, followed one very simple rule: keep the blood blue. That meant marrying other royals. But here's the problem. There were only so many royal families in Europe, and they were already all related. So by the 16th and 17th centuries, marrying for politics really meant marrying your cousin again. In some cases, uncle-niece marriages became the only way to preserve the throne's so-called purity. And in doing so, they quietly invited in centuries of tragedy, illness, and genetic collapse. You might wonder, didn't they realize this was a terrible idea? Well, sort of. But bloodlines were sacred. Marrying a non-royal was unthinkable. It'd be like mixing tap water into a sacred wine. Only this sacred wine was starting to go a bit vinegary. The Habsburgs especially took pride in their dynastic purity, even as it slowly crushed them from within. Historians still argue whether the nobility truly understood the biological cost of inbreeding. After all, genetic science was centuries away, but they did notice things, like how their heirs often came out fragile, sickly, or as some records cruelly put it, not quite right. There were whispers. There were hidden wings of castles. But still, the marriages continued. In the flickering torchlight of this royal hallway, you might be tempted to think these were rare cases. But no, the sheer volume of intermarriage is jaw-dropping. One genetic study of Spanish royalty between 1550 and 1800 showed that some monarchs had higher inbreeding coefficients than the children of siblings. Not cousin siblings. Take a moment to let that settle in. You, sitting there all cozy in your blanket, might have a family tree that branches a little more generously than Europe's royal elite. That's already a genetic win. Now, zoom out. For a moment, this wasn't just Spain. England, Austria, France, Russia, they all played this game. And as the generations rolled forward, the consequences grew louder, like a clock ticking toward collapse. Some monarchs developed facial deformities, others neurological issues. Some couldn't have children. Some had far too many, but most didn't survive infancy. You might ask, was there no one to step in and say, maybe don't marry your niece? Funny thing, plenty of advisors tried. But when tradition and divine right are involved, rational voices tend to lose. One Spanish noble wrote that the Habsburgs were melting away like wax candles in a hot room. But the dynasty pressed on, candle by candle. Let's be clear, though, these royals weren't monsters. Many were simply born into roles with expectations older than the buildings they lived in. They were told it was noble, even holy, to preserve the family line at all costs. You can't really blame a young princess for marrying her cousin when she's been taught since birth that it's her royal duty and maybe her only value. Quirky fact before we tiptoe onward. At least one royal family employed court artists to subtly fix certain features in official portraits. Chin too big? Just soften it. Nose too hooked? Smooth it out. Early Photoshop, Renaissance edition dot. So as you wander deeper into these echoing halls, passing portraits with oddly familiar eyes and chins you could park a wagon on, keep in mind, this isn't fiction. It's just history that got entangled. Literally dot, and just ahead waits one of the most famous jaws in history. You stop in front of a portrait so exaggerated it almost feels rude to stare, but you can't help it. The subject's lower jaw juts out with such heroic stubbornness it casts a shadow on his own collar. His lips can't quite meet. His nose appears to have thrown in the towel halfway down. This is Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and a proud product of the Habsburg line. But really, you're looking at the jaw, the one that made the Habsburgs infamous dot. It's called mandibular prognathism, but the world knows it better as the Habsburg jaw. That distinct protrusion wasn't just an odd family trait. It was a billboard-sized red flag for the dangers of centuries of inbreeding. And Charles V? He had it in full, but he wasn't the only one. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a single feature, it came with a whole package. Oversized lips, large noses, speech impediments, and difficulties chewing food. Charles reportedly had to eat with his head tilted to one side just to avoid choking. Imagine ruling an empire when soup is a tactical hazard. Now, you might think, that's one family. Surely, not everyone looked like that. But a 2009 study took a deep dive into 11 Habsburg portraits and found consistent markers of this jaw across generations. The more inbred the ruler, the more severe the condition. Historians still argue whether artists exaggerated or downplayed it, but genetic analysis supports what the portraits whisper. This wasn't artistic license. This was real. You shift your gaze to a painting of Charles V's son, Philip II. Same jaw, same slope. Different beard, but the chin's doing the heavy lifting. And Philip's son? Same again. At some point, you start to wonder if the Habsburgs had a family crest or just a family profile dot by the time the Spanish Habsburg line reached Charles II. The final product of all that inbreeding. The situation had turned tragic. We'll meet him soon, but tonight, let's dwell a little more in this gallery of regal geometry. You're not just looking at faces, you're reading a biological timeline. Every chin, lip, and eyelid tells you how many branches were snipped from that family tree. What's wild is how intentional it all was. The Habsburgs believed their bloodline was sacred. So, they married nieces and uncles with the kind of casual confidence most people reserve for choosing matching curtains. Charles V himself married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Their son Philip II also married a cousin, and then his own niece, and then another cousin. This wasn't a mistake, it was policy. Quirky detour. Charles V had a peculiar sense of legacy. He commissioned a self-portrait to be painted as a dead man lying in his coffin. "Just a nice little visual for the historians," he said. "Who wouldn't want a deathbed glam shot?" But underneath all that power and paint, there was deep fragility. Charles suffered from gout, epilepsy, and depression. He eventually retired to a monastery in his 40s, basically the royal equivalent of rage-quitting a job. While he lived out his days praying and watching clocks, his empire began to fray. Some blamed politics. Others whispered about the inbreeding catching up to him. The truth? Probably both. Now tilt your head, just a little, and imagine being one of his courtiers. You bow to the emperor, trying not to stare at his impossibly sharp jawline, nodding along as he mumbles through another half-swallowed speech. Your job is to interpret, obey, and not flinch when his chin cuts a hole through his lace collar. You wonder if the crown fits better backward. Historians still debate how much of Charles V's health was due to genetics versus the pressures of ruling an empire stretched across continents. After all, even non-inbred kings suffered from stress, bad diets, and very little medical understanding. But the combination of visible physical features and consistent medical conditions across the Habsburg line suggests something deeper. Something inherited. One Spanish doctor at the time described Charles as always tired, often confused, and sometimes unaware of his surroundings. The prescription? Prayer and wine. A medieval 2-for-1 special dot as you drift past more portraits. You begin to notice the eyes. Heavy-lidded, watery, unfocused. These aren't the eyes of confident rulers. They're the eyes of people trying to stay awake at dinner. And dinner, for many of them, was an ordeal. The jaw made chewing difficult, combined with poor digestion and frequent tooth decay. It's no wonder so many royal feasts ended with someone discreetly coughing into a napkin and whispering for a bucket. And yet, they were emperors. They ruled vast territories, commanded armies, and reshaped the maps of Europe, all while barely able to enunciate the word empire. What does that tell you? That inbreeding didn't always stop power, but it sure made it messy. The Habsburgs clung to their lineage so tightly, they forgot to look at what it was turning them into. So as you continue down the hallway, past yet another oil painting of a jaw with a man attached, you start to realize Europe wasn't built on strength alone. It was built on obsession with blood, with family, with legacy. Even when that legacy started drooling. You step into a smaller chamber now, quiet and thick with old velvet drapes. A fire crackles gently in the hearth, though you suspect it's more for show than warmth. On a heavy oak table, stacks of yellowing parchments sprawl in looping ink marriage. Contracts, dozens, hundreds, all signed with the same surnames over and over again. You're not in a room of love stories. You're in a room of strategy. In royal Europe, marriage wasn't about affection. It was about dynastic survival, political advantage, and above all, bloodlines. And when you're playing a Game of Thrones with only 7 pieces on the board, you end up moving the same cousins around a lot. You start to see names reappear like echoes. Louis, Maria, Ferdinand, Leopold, again and again. You lean in. A contract from 1565. Philip II of Spain marries Elizabeth of Valois, a cousin. Another from 1580. Philip marries Anna of Austria, another cousin. You blink. In 1599, he marries his own niece. That's not a typo. That's policy. By now, you're probably thinking, there must have been other options. There were. But marrying outsiders, commoners, or lower nobility was risky. It diluted the so-called purity of the line. Worse, it could lead to political instability. So instead, kings chose to marry the people they already trusted. Their cousins, nieces, and even their siblings' children. Ooh wasn't part of the vocabulary. Not yet. Historians still argue whether the obsession with keeping it in the family was more about politics or paranoia. Some say it was fear of outsiders disrupting the balance. Others believe it was about maintaining control, generation after generation, even if it meant marrying into genetic disaster. And here's the kicker. They had charts. Literal hand-drawn genealogy trees that guided every proposal, betrothal, and wedding. You can almost hear the advisors murmuring over them. If we pair Maria with Leopold, then the Spanish and Austrian crowns stay aligned. But, oh dear, that's a first cousin once removed. Perfect. It didn't help that royalty lived in a kind of echo chamber surrounded by courtiers who reinforced their worldviews and servants who said only what was safe. And so the echo deepened, generation after generation, until entire family trees folded back in on themselves like origami gone wrong. You pause in front of a portrait of Maria Theresa of Austria. She's painted with grace and power, but behind her stands a line of ancestors so tightly interwoven you could mistake them for twins. She had 16 children, and guess what? Most of them married relatives. Her daughter, Marie Antoinette, that doomed Queen of France, married her second cousin once removed, Louis XVI, and we all know how that turned out. Quirky fact, one Habsburg noble actually married the sister of his deceased wife and his own niece in one woman. It sounds like a riddle, but it happened. The nobility ran out of branches so completely that they started overlapping titles and bloodlines just to keep things running. They did not. By the 18th century, signs of degeneration were clear. Fertility problems, miscarriages, infant deaths, and adult rulers who struggled with mental clarity, physical coordination, or both. You can't blame it all on inbreeding. Europe had terrible hygiene, bad medical practices, and a plague problem. But the genetic weight of royal matchmaking certainly didn't help. Imagine being a young royal, barely 16, told that your future husband is twice your age and also your uncle. You smile, you curtsy, and you marry him. Because that's what's expected. And if your children don't survive, well, try again. That's what heirs are for. You take a breath. This room smells like old parchment and wilted roses. You glance. Back at the fire, it flickers, but gives no heat. Kind of like these marriages, ceremonial, controlled, but rarely warm. Every match made was less about love and more about leverage. Even the Pope got involved. In cases where marriages were just a little too close, royal families simply requested a papal dispensation, a kind of go-ahead from the Vatican, and they almost always got it. So even God, it seemed, was on board with the cousin strategy. Historians still puzzle over how royals managed to hold power for so long despite these genetic warning signs. Was it sheer inertia? Was it the loyalty of subjects who believed in divine right, even as their kings struggled to walk straight? Or was it the sheer pageantry of it all, the golden crowns, the velvet robes, the choirs echoing through marble cathedrals? You exhale slowly. There's something eerie about a system that prioritizes blood over health, charted legacy over human cost. But that was royal Europe. You married for blood. Not compatibility, not kindness. Just blood. And as you prepare to move to the next hall, one thought lingers. What happens when you finally run out of cousins? You step into a colder corridor, now stone underfoot, walls hung with heavy tapestries that fail to muffle the sense of dread in the air. The mood shifts. You're about to meet a king so steeped in inbreeding he became quite literally the end of a line. His name? Charles II of Spain. And if there were ever a cautionary tale carved in velvet and gold, it's him. He's known in history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But that nickname wasn't playful. It was whispered with genuine fear. His subjects believed he was cursed, that demons lived in his body, that witches twisted his limbs in the womb. And honestly, it was easier to believe in sorcery than face the truth. This was what 5 generations of uncle, niece, and cousin marriages created. Charles was born in 1661 and immediately baffled his nurses. His head was enormous. He couldn't sit up until he was nearly 4. He didn't speak until he was almost 8. He drooled constantly. And yet, he was king. At age 3, you walked beside his cradle, yes. It was made of gilded silver, and you watched as courtiers murmur and physicians shrug. He's alive, they say. That's enough. But Charles wasn't just physically frail, he was genetically collapsing. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, meaning roughly a quarter of his genes were duplicates. That's higher than the theoretical offspring of a brother-sister union. His body was a portrait of compounding recessive traits, skeletal deformities, chronic infections, intestinal issues, possible hydrocephalus. And yet, Spain clung to him. Because he had the right name. Historians still argue whether Charles suffered from multiple rare conditions, or whether one singular syndrome could explain it all. Some point to Fragile X, others suggest pituitary disorders. One bold theory even proposed Klinefelter's syndrome with hypothyroidism and mandibular prognathism. Yes, they needed a buffet of conditions to explain just one king. You pause at his portrait. It's not kind. Charles stares blankly forward, lower lip dangling, eyes unfocused. He looks both ancient and infantile. His Habsburg jaw is now a caricature. His mouth doesn't close. His tongue doesn't quite fit. You wonder what it must have been like living inside that body. Expected to rule, to marry, to carry on the line. Charles tried. He married twice. Both marriages were, predictably, to close relatives. Neither produced a child. Or, as one court report delicately put it, His Majesty labors under a natural incapacity. One French ambassador wrote home, "He is so ugly he appears to have been assembled from the leftovers of other people." Rude, yes, but also horrifyingly accurate. And yet, Charles was said to be kind. He loved animals. He was deeply religious. He tried to be a good king, even as his own ministers bypassed him in decision-making. He was, in many ways, a puppet. Ruler, tugged by factions who feared what would happen when he finally died. Because here's the thing, everyone knew he would die young. The question was, when? And what chaos would follow. Quirky fact, Charles's court once exhumed the corpse of a long-dead royal saint and made Charles kiss the bones, hoping it would cure his infertility. It didn't, but the smell apparently cleared the room. As Charles aged, he didn't grow stronger. His legs remained weak, his vision blurred. He was often bedridden. And yet the pressure mounted. Spain needed an heir. Without one, the War of Spanish Succession loomed a potential Europe-wide disaster. Imagine a continent on edge because one man, genetically stitched together by too few threads, could not produce a child. Eventually, Charles died in 1700, at age 38. His autopsy, if you can stomach the old-timey medical drama, reported that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his intestines were putrefied, and his head was full of water. Whether those details were true or exaggerated, one thing was certain. Spain's ruling line died with him. Historians still debate whether Charles was a victim of royal pressure, genetic collapse, or supernatural belief. Likely all three. But what's clear is this: he was the final ember of a dynasty that had burned itself out on the altar of purity. As you step out of the corridor, back into the warmer light of the gallery, you glance over your shoulder one last time. Behind you, Charles remains frozen in oil and velvet, staring blankly into forever. He ruled, he suffered, and he left behind a Europe on the brink. And all because, too, many people thought keeping the blood pure was more important than keeping the heir alive. You're out of the palace now, stepping into the cool evening air, but you're not off the hook yet. In fact, now you're holding a heavy, awkwardly folded scroll of tangled names and looping lines. It's a royal family tree, though. Tree might be generous. What you're really looking at is something closer to a bramble a-curling, looping knot of bloodlines that fold back on themselves like a snake eating its own tail. Welcome to genetic geometry. Royal-style. You find a bench beneath the torchlit archway and unfurl the chart. At first glance, it's impressive. Ornate crests, swirling calligraphy, Latin phrases that try too hard. But then you trace the connections. Maria marries Philip. Their son marries his cousin. Their son marries his niece. You blink. You go back. You're not wrong. You're just watching the same last name circle endlessly like a medieval washing machine. And here's the weird part. The royals knew it was tight, but most didn't have the faintest grasp of what that might do biologically. They thought in terms of legitimacy, alliance, inheritance, not recessive traits or genetic bottlenecks. Historians still argue whether medieval and early modern nobles understood the consequences of marrying within the family. Some say the signs were obvious: sickly children, high infant mortality, and more than a few royal toddlers who didn't live to be teens. Others believe they chalked it up to divine will or bad luck. In either case, they certainly didn't stop. Let's pause here. Time for a mainstream fact. Inbreeding increases the chin-do chance that harmful recessive genes will express themselves. Every human carries a few of these quirks, disorders, weaknesses. Marry someone distantly related. No problem. Marry your niece. Big problem. If both parents carry the same flawed gene, the child is far more likely to inherit it twice, and that's when symptoms start showing. In a healthy population, genetic diversity acts like a safety net. In royal Europe, that net had holes big enough to lose an empire through. You trace your finger along one infamous connection: Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, uncle and niece. Their son was Charles II, the poor soul you just met in the last corridor. That's not just unfortunate. That's textbook genetic overload. And the tree shows it clearly. Just 5 names repeat again and again: Habsburg, Bourbon, Valois, Trastamara, Wittelsbach. It's less of a forest and more of a bonsai. Quirky tidbit. In some cases, royal genealogists had to invent new ways of describing relationships. 1. Austrian noble was described as the cousin-uncle-in-law of the bride. There wasn't a word for what they were anymore. Just a shrug and a ceremony, but don't feel too smug. Even today, humans aren't great at visualizing these risks. We think in terms of social closeness, not genetic. 2 third cousins might seem practically strangers, but genetically, still dicey. The difference is, modern people don't typically chart their marriages with papal dispensations and 20-generation scrolls. Royals did, and still said, "Perfect, let's do it again." As you scan the tree, you notice something else: dead ends. Children who never made it past infancy. Branches that stop after just a name and a year. Some royal families had infant mortality rates over 80%. That's not just bad luck. That's natural selection whispering, "Please stop." Of course, they didn't. Because every royal child wasn't just a baby. They were a dynastic hope, a symbol of continuity, an insurance policy in a crown. And if the firstborn died, try again. And again. And again. You flip the chart to another dynasty, this time the House of Bourbon. Same pattern. Slightly fewer jawlines, but just as many cousin marriages. Louis XIII of France, for example, married Anne of Austria. She was his double first cousin, once removed. That's a mouthful and also a genealogical facepalm. Historians still debate the precise role that inbreeding played in the decline of certain dynasties. Some say it was only part of the problem plague. War, famine, and rebellion played larger roles. Others argue that genetic fragility made royal houses vulnerable to those other pressures. A king who can't speak clearly or stay awake through meetings is a king who can't govern. A child who dies at 5 means no heir. No heir means civil war. You pause and imagine a royal nursery, toys of ivory, cradles of silk, and beside them, physicians with grim expressions. Every cough becomes a council meeting, every bruise, a crisis. And every generation, the chances grow slimmer. Even the Habsburgs eventually noticed something was wrong. They started commissioning deeper genealogies, trying to marry less related cousins, reaching sideways into younger, less connected branches. But it was like trying to patch a sinking ship with lace. And then there's the irony. All this obsessive matchmaking was designed to secure dynasties, to stabilize power. And it worked for a while. But the more the bloodlines tightened, the more the legacy began to collapse under its own weight. What began as a strategy became a trap. You roll up the scroll and set it aside. You've seen enough loops for one night. The trees were supposed to bloom into empires. Instead, they folded in on themselves kings crowning cousins, queens birthing half-nephews, and names repeating like an echo you can't silence. And as you stand, one quiet truth hums beneath the surface. The most powerful people in Europe were undone not by their enemies, but by their family albums. You step into a hushed hallway, this one lined not with portraits or scrolls, but with tiny cribs, wooden, ornate, and far too quiet. The air is still, almost reverent, like a chapel that's forgotten how to sing. These are the nurseries of Europe's royal palaces, and tonight, you're walking through the softest and saddest wing of history. Here, lullabies were whispered in Latin. Silk gowns were prepared before a child could crawl. And yet, so many of these cradles were barely used. Because if royal inbreeding had a loud symptom, it was whispered first in the nursery. You pause at a golden bassinet. There's no nameplate, just a birth year and a death year. The same year, royal families, especially in the Spanish and Austrian courts, experienced alarmingly high infant mortality rates. Some royal couples lost 6, 7, even 10 children before one survived long enough to toddle into a coronation portrait. Imagine the quiet after a royal birth relief celebration, and then days of watching the baby just breathe, hoping that little chest kept rising and falling. And if it didn't, well, the next heir was already being prayed for. Mainstream historical fact. Between the 1500s and 1800s, royal households had far higher infant mortality than their wealth and status should suggest. Even with the best food, warmest rooms, and most expensive physicians, the babies still died. And many historians agree genetics was a major reason. Recessive conditions like hydrocephalus, IMMUNE deficiencies, and certain metabolic disorders silently swept through these families. Often, the infants were born looking healthy, only to fade within weeks or months. There was no medical vocabulary for it at the time, no DNA tests or ultrasounds. Just silence and swaddling and grief behind closed curtains. You kneel beside. One cradle. A toy rattle lies untouched, carved from ivory and shaped like a lion. A lion for a child who never learned to roar. One particularly chilling case? Maria Anna of Spain, daughter of Philip III and Margaret of Austria. She had 6 full siblings. Only 2 lived to adulthood. One died before turning 1. Another survived to age 7, barely. Their family tree reads more like a tombstone collage than a lineage. And still, the family continued to marry cousins, as if hoping this time the math would magically work. Historians still argue whether royal advisors understood that the inbreeding might be the cause. Some suggest they did, but faced enormous political pressure not to say it out loud. After all, to accuse the system was to accuse the crown itself. And no one wanted to be the one who told the king, maybe stop marrying your niece. Instead, blame was placed elsewhere. Witchcraft, divine punishment, even poor maternal behavior. Queens were told not to eat certain foods, or to pray harder, or to rest more. All while quietly suffering miscarriage after miscarriage in their velvet-lined rooms, quirky detail. Some royal birthing rooms were designed with trapdoors beneath the bed, in case the child didn't survive. That way, a replacement baby could be smuggled in and passed off as the rightful heir. Did it ever happen? No one can prove it. But the rumor alone speaks volumes about the pressure these women faced. And let's talk about those women for a moment. The queens, duchesses, and princesses. They weren't just wives. They were wombs, chosen not for love, but for bloodline compatibility. If they failed to produce a viable heir, they were blamed, cast aside, even locked away. Never mind that. The real culprit was often the tangled DNA passed down from uncle to niece, cousin to cousin. You pass another cradle. This one has a tiny blanket embroidered with a crown and initials you don't recognize, a footnote in a history book, a heartbeat that flickered briefly and went out. Occasionally, a royal child would survive but suffer from mysterious ailments. Chronic fevers, seizures, developmental delays. They were hidden away, sometimes erased from official records altogether. If you think royal families proudly displayed every child born to them, think again. Some lived entire lives enshadowed. Rooms cared for by discreet servants, their existence known only to a few. One tragic example: Don Carlos, the son of Philip II of Spain. He was reportedly unstable, violent, and plagued with physical and mental challenges. Rumors swirled that he was kept under lock and key, fed through a slot in the door. Whether those tales are exaggerated or not, the fact remains he was a product of intense inbreeding, and his condition was no isolated case. You take a slow breath. The air smells faintly of lavender, like old linens and effort. A failed effort. Here's something oddly modern. In some courts, midwives began keeping quiet records, tallies of births, stillbirths, and infant deaths. Not for public use, but for themselves. A quiet form of resistance. An attempt to make sense of what they were witnessing. Because even back then, some women were beginning to suspect this isn't normal. This many children shouldn't be dying. Something is wrong with the blood, but no one dared say it outright. Not in the grand halls, not in front of the portraits. So the dying continued. The silence deepened. You leave the nursery now, the shadows, growing longer behind you. And as you glance back once more, a single thought tugs at your chest like a cold breeze. For all the power they craved, all the thrones they inherited, the royal families of Europe never figured out the one rule nature refuses to bend for anyone genes don't care about your crown. The hallway widens into a long ceremonial chamber, echoing with imagined footsteps and the soft rustle of silk gowns. Here, beneath crystal chandeliers and painted ceilings, we come to the business end of royal inbreeding, the marriage market. You don't find love letters here. You find treaties with rings. In this world, royal daughters were not daughters. They were bargaining chips, slipped across diplomatic tables to buy peace, seal alliances, or make rivals jealous. And their grooms, often cousins, often much older. Sometimes both. It wasn't a question of affection. It was a question of how many thrones can we glue together without inviting a war. You walk past a table where 4 bearded men with serious expressions examine a map of Europe, not for conquest, but for matchmaking. One says, the French princess is only 12, but if we wait 2 years, she can marry her uncle's son, and then the Austrian border will hold. Another nods, scribbling notes as if negotiating livestock. That's how it worked. Cousins were currency. You weren't marrying a person, you were marrying a crown, a treaty, a region, a name. Mainstream historical fact. European monarchies used strategic marriages to link dynasties and consolidate power. The Habsburgs, in particular, took this to Shakespearean levels of drama. One of their mottos was literally, "Let others wage war. You, lucky Austria, marry." And marry they did. Again and again and again. You glance at a gilded invitation from 1560. A grand wedding between Joanna of Austria and John Manuel of Portugal. On paper, it united Spain and Portugal. In reality, it united first cousins. Their son would be Sebastian of Portugal, who died in battle at 24, without an heir, likely infertile, possibly ill, and definitely another genetic casualty. Historians still debate how aware the families were of the health risks. They knew, certainly, that some lines faded. They whispered about the weak blood or sickly heirs. But whether they understood the why, that's murkier. Some sources suggest they suspected, but political gain always outweighed medical. Hesitation. You pause at a portrait of Marie Louise of Austria, sent to Spain to marry Charles II. Yes, the same Charles with the Habsburg jaw and tragic health. She was 16. He was her double cousin. Her letters home read like slow heartbreak, loneliness, strangeness, and fear. The pressure to conceive was enormous. Every meal was watched. Every weight change analyzed. And still, no heir came. Quirky. Side note, royal physicians used to inspect the bed sheets after wedding nights. Not for gossip, for proof. Was the marriage consummated? Was the queen fertile? Was the king capable? One royal doctor even wrote a report titled, "On the Seminal Weakness of His Majesty." No pressure, Your Majesty. And then there were the royal child brides. You peer into a side room where mannequins display wedding gowns no taller than your waist. Some girls were betrothed at age 3, married by age 12. Not always consummated immediately, but the expectation loomed like a sword. Grow up quickly and give birth faster. These weren't weddings. These were transactions wrapped in lace. You move forward through the gallery, past tapestries depicting royal couples holding hands, gazing into each other's eyes, though behind them, political maps are stitched subtly into the background. Because every smile was choreographed, every kiss rehearsed. Even the honeymoon was often attended by witnesses, just in case proof was needed. And it didn't always work. These marriages were high-stakes bets, and sometimes they backfired. Spectacularly, one famous example. Maria Antonia of Austria married into the French Bourbon family. The plan was to unite Austria and France, creating a peaceful buffer against Prussia. Instead, she was mocked, politically isolated, and died at 23 after a difficult childbirth. The child didn't survive either. The alliance frayed. The experiment failed. Historians still debate whether these unions were more successful diplomatically than militarily. Some worked. Others only delayed inevitable wars. But what's clear is this: the cost was almost always borne by the bride. Because, while kings remarried, sons were tutored, and alliances were drawn, the princesses suffered. They were shipped across borders, renamed, redressed, and expected to produce perfect heirs with a man they might have only met twice, and who, more often than not, was their cousin. You pause at a ceremonial archway, the kind that might have been walked beneath by a teenage girl in a brocade gown 2 sizes too big, holding flowers she didn't choose, beside a man she barely knew. The crowd would have cheered. The trumpets would have blared. And inside her chest, a very young heart might have whispered, "I hope I survive this." Quirky tradition? Some royal families gifted brides with a ceremonial bedchamber staffed by witnesses, not for protection, for documentation. One woman was assigned to observe whether the proper vigor was displayed by the groom. That was her actual job title. Mistress of the first bedding. You take a final look around this chamber of ceremonial contracts. It's elegant, it's precise. It's a monument to logistics dressed as romance. And as you move forward once more, the thought sharpens like a tay. Cold draft. These weren't love stories. These were arranged collisions. And the fallout. That's still echoing in the blood of kings. You now find yourself beneath a gilded ceiling splashed with suns, where every surface seems to radiate gold. Welcome to Versailles, the shimmering heart of Louis XIV's France. And while this place practically bathes itself in light, tonight, you're here to explore something shadowy. Why this king, despite all the royal inbreeding around him, turned out surprisingly sturdy. Louis XIV, the Sun King, crowned at 5, ruled for 72 years, war heels, and micromanaged fountains. You know the type, but here's what makes him curious. While his Habsburg cousins were tripping over their own bloodlines and drooling through state dinners, Louis XIV, product of generations of strategic, often inbred marriages, was not just functional. He was thriving. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV was simply less inbred than his royal peers, or whether France had just gotten lucky with a few stronger branches on their tree. Genetic studies suggest his inbreeding coefficient was notably lower than the Habsburgs, still not great, but far less jaw-dropping. His parents, Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, were double first cousins once removed. Yes, it's a thing, which is still a risky combo. But perhaps not a biological doomsday dot, and maybe the French court had started to take subtle notes. You pass. A tapestry showing Louis's wedding to Maria Theresa of Spain, his cousin. Yes, but not his double niece like some Habsburg matches. A small win. Quirky fact: Louis was born after 23 years of childless marriage between his parents. His birth was so unexpected, they literally named him Deudon, God-given. And while many assumed he'd be sickly, he grew up with a thick head of curls, a flair for dance, and a stomach for roasted meat and royal ego. You imagine the French court whispering behind folding fans. He doesn't drool. He stands up straight. He reads. Miraculous, truly. But don't be fooled. Louis XIV's own children didn't all share his vigor. Of his 6 legitimate children, only 1 outlived him. Several died in infancy, and some showed signs of physical frailty. Still, compared to the collapsing Spanish line, France was faring better, marginally. You strolled past murals of Louis staging battle reenactments in full wig and armor. Was it all theater? Of course. But it was coherent theater something. Charles II of Spain could never have pulled off. And yet, that Habsburg connection lingered. Louis's wife, Maria Theresa, was the daughter of Philip IV of Spain, meaning their children carried Habsburg genes too. Not a deal breaker, but certainly not a genetic cleanse. And when Louis later had children with other women, many other women, he sometimes did so with women who were also related to him, lightly, casually. Still, his policy on inbreeding was more practical than mystical. France wasn't obsessed with purity the way Spain and Austria were. In fact, Louis regularly married his illegitimate children into noble lines, effectively spreading his DNA all over Europe without the bottleneck effect of repeated cousin pairings. Historians still puzzle over Louis's health. He lived to 76. He danced in court ballets into his 60s. He suffered from gout, diabetes, and eventually gangrene, but none of the dramatic genetic collapses seen in Charles II or Don Carlos. Was it cleaner breeding, a stronger maternal line, or just a statistical fluke? You pass a garden path, impossibly manicured, just like Louis liked it. Every shrub trimmed, every pebble placed. He controlled the court the same way. The nobility of the sword were tamed into courtiers. Dissent was silenced with ribbons and theater seats. Versailles itself was a giant perfumed leash, quirky aside. Louis demanded that nobles apply for the honor of helping him get dressed each morning. It was called the levee, and yes, handing him his shirt could earn you a title. Imagine being so genetically stable that your morning robe became a career ladder. But even here, under gold ceilings and steady rule, the effects of royal bloodline thinking lingered. Louis pushed for a marriage between his grandson and a Spanish princess, yet another cousin connection. And from that pairing came more fragile offspring. Because even if you're built strong, you're still building with the same brittle bricks. France did have its share of hidden ailments. Rumors swirled of madness in side branches of the Bourbon family, of illegitimate lines quietly vanishing, and of royal babies who didn't survive long enough to be painted. So while Louis XIV may have looked like the glowing exception, he wasn't. Immune to the same genetic rot lurking behind velvet curtains, historians still debate how much of Louis's health was due to gene flow versus sheer luck. His grandfather, Henry IV, had been something of a genetic outlier, married far outside the usual Habsburg pools. Maybe that sliver of diversity gave Louis a sturdier launchpad. You lean on a marble balustrade, looking down at a fountain depicting Neptune and Tritons. It's absurdly elaborate, like everything Louis did. But beneath the pageantry was a rare thing in royal Europe, a monarch who didn't seem to be crumbling. And yet, as history moves forward, even this golden legacy would falter. His heirs, too many cousins once more, would be sucked into the genetic vortex that eventually consumed much of European nobility. So tonight, you give Louis XIV his due. He stood tall, danced long, ruled wide, and aged slowly. But even he couldn't change the system. He could only glide through it more gracefully than most. Now you find yourself beneath grayer skies, damp with English mist and the smell of wet stone. The candles are fewer here, and the corridors draftier. You've arrived at Kew Palace, a modest red brick royal residence just outside of London. Inside these walls, a man once paced endlessly, talking to trees and foaming at the mouth. Tonight, you meet George III, the Mad King. Or was he? That's what we're here to explore. George III reigned from 1760 to 1820, making him one of Britain's longest-serving monarchs. But he's remembered less for longevity and more for losing America and losing his mind. He's also one of the most studied examples in the modern debate about royal inbreeding and mental illness. Mainstream fact: George descended from the House of Hanover, a German line that had been marrying its cousins at a relatively steady clip. His own parents were second cousins. His grandmother and grandfather, also cousins. You're seeing a pattern, right? George was intelligent, deeply religious, and famously faithful to his wife, Queen Charlotte, whom he married without ever having met. They had 15 children. That's not a typo, 15. And by all accounts, he was a doting father who loved farming, astronomy, and moral philosophy. He was, in short, pretty wholesome. Until he wasn't dot in 1788, George began to unravel. He talked without stopping for hours. He wrote 400-word sentences. He claimed to converse with angels and glowed with what physicians called unnatural cheerfulness. At one point, he had to be restrained in a straitjacket, screaming incoherently and foaming at the mouth. Now, here's where it gets murky. Historians still argue whether George III suffered from porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system, or whether he had bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia. Porphyria was long the favorite theory, especially because it can be hereditary and cause sudden, dramatic changes in mood, hallucinations, and purple-tinged urine, a real thing that showed up in early medical notes, but newer studies suggest something more psychological. Bipolar disorder fits his episodes, long stretches of stability, followed by bursts of manic behavior and confusion. If true, this would make him one of the earliest royal figures whose mental illness was recorded in painstaking and sometimes cruel detail. Quirky detail. During one of George's worst spells, he reportedly spent entire days talking nonsense, insisting that he could speak with dead kings and that he personally invented the sun. He also tried to shake hands with a tree, believing it was the King of Prussia. The tree, to its credit, remained diplomatic. But was this just a tragic twist of fate? Or another case of bad genetic stacking? The House of Hanover didn't have the extreme inbreeding levels of the Habsburgs, but the repeated cousin marriages certainly didn't help. George's gene pool wasn't a puddle, but it was still shallow. And remember, mental illness often runs in families. His great-grandfather, George I, had a sister kept locked away in a German castle due to what was described as melancholy, with fits. His son George IV also showed signs of emotional instability and chronic alcoholism. The royal nut didn't fall far. You walk slowly past a writing desk where George once composed long, rambling letters to Parliament. His handwriting becomes increasingly illegible during his episodes. More evidence that whatever plagued him wasn't just stress or grief, it was something deeper. Something brewing inside, perhaps since birth. Historians still debate the impact of George's illness on Britain's politics. His episodes led to the Regency crisis of 1788 to 89, when Parliament considered transferring power to his son. They didn't. George briefly recovered, but by 1811 his condition returned with such force that he was declared permanently unfit to rule. His son ruled as Prince Regent from then until his father's death. And how did the court handle it? With secrecy, of course. George was hidden from view. His doctors issued cryptic updates. Public rumors flourished. Some said he'd gone blind from madness. Others claimed he ran naked through Windsor Palace. Few knew the truth. You pause beside a locked door. Behind it, George would sometimes be kept during his worst episodes, ranting to invisible guests. The walls were reportedly padded, the windows barred. His caretakers described his howling as pitiful and unending. Quirky aside, he loved music. Even in madness, he responded to melodies. Once, a harpsichordist played a slow piece in the Thivolna. Next room, and George stopped shrieking and quietly wept. So was George III a victim of inbreeding? A cautionary tale of mental illness misunderstood? Or simply an unlucky king born in a time without therapy, medication or compassion for mental health? Probably all three. His story marks a shift. For the first time in royal history, madness became public. It could no longer be locked away in towers or written off as spiritual punishment. George's collapse played out in real time in newspapers, court whispers, and public caricatures. And perhaps, in a strange way, his suffering opened the door for a little more humanity in the monarchy. A little more understanding that kings, too, are fragile. You step away now from the quiet red palace, the mists closing in. George is gone. The madness remains in journals, letters, and fading ink. A man born into power, undone not by war, not by rebellion, but perhaps by the chemistry of his own brain, sparked by a family tree that was just too narrow for stability. Now your path takes a bloodier turn literally. You find yourself standing in a shadowed corridor lined with long glass cases. Inside, royal gloves, christening gowns, and bandages, stiff with age, stained. This is the corridor of the bleeding. Royals, and at its center flows a quiet but devastating condition. Hemophilia. Hemophilia is the ultimate royal curse, not as visible as a Habsburg jaw, not as dramatic as madness, but far more quietly lethal. It's a genetic disorder that prevents the blood from clotting properly. A bruise can become a crisis. A scrape can become a hemorrhage. A stubbed toe, a funeral. And among European royals, it showed up with terrifying consistency. Mainstream historical fact: hemophilia is X-linked recessive. That means it travels through mothers, often without symptoms, and strikes sons. And the most famous royal carrier, Queen Victoria of Britain, a woman known for black gowns and empire, yes, but also for unknowingly seeding a blood disorder through nearly every royal house in Europe. You pause in front of her. Portrait, she looks stern, modest, unimpressed. But her DNA had a secret. One of her 9 children, Prince Leopold, was born with hemophilia. He bruised easily, walked cautiously, and died at 30 after a minor fall led to unstoppable bleeding. And Victoria? She passed the gene on to 3 of her daughters, who married into Spain, Germany, and most fatefully, Russia. Their sons, grandsons, and great-grandsons would bleed in palaces from Madrid to St. Petersburg. Quirky fact: royal doctors in the 19th century used to prescribe leeching to treat hemophilia, yes, removing blood from someone who already couldn't clot it. A medical decision that, in hindsight, reads like dark comedy. But for the families, it wasn't funny. It was terrifying. Imagine a toddler prince trips on a toy. He bumps his knee, and that bump begins to swell and swell until he can't bend the leg. Internal bleeding. No way to stop it. No cure. Just whispered prayers and damp compresses. You hear the servants scurry. You hear the doctor say, again, we must be very, very gentle. Historians still argue over how much the royal households understood about hemophilia early on. In the beginning, it seemed like bad luck. But as more sons of Victoria's daughters began to bleed and die, the pattern became undeniable. One of the most famous victims? Prince Friedrich of Hesse and by Rhine, Victoria's great-grandson. He died at age 2 after falling from a window. His bleeding couldn't be stopped. The family was devastated, but also afraid. They knew this was no isolated incident. The royal bloodline was now fragile in the most literal way. And then there was Spain. You stopped before a small glass case containing the sash of Alfonso XIII, King of Spain, who had several sons, 2 of whom inherited hemophilia. The Spanish court tried to hide it. Whispers were managed, doctors silenced. But the truth dripped out slowly, like the blood from another bruised knee. In fact, Alfonso had to send one son to Switzerland where medical care was more advanced and the political optics were less damaging. Because in a monarchy, weakness is never just weakness, it's a potential constitutional crisis. And yet, the marriages continued, because the pull of royal matchmaking was stronger than the fear of illness. After all, what's one bleeding prince when there's a kingdom to secure? You step closer to a faded diary belonging to one of Victoria's daughters. The page reads, "He fell again. The swelling has returned. I fear the night. No frills, no poetry, just dread. Even more chilling is how these children often grew. Up with a slow-motion doom. They couldn't run. They couldn't roughhouse. They couldn't even floss too hard. Each cough, each stumble was a moment of held breath. And in the worst cases, spontaneous bleeding into joints or brains could happen without warning. No injury needed, just time." Quirky aside, hemophilia was once referred to in royal circles as the sacred disease, as if its royal bearers were chosen by fate. Some believed it gave them a strange kind of nobility martyrs of bloodline, but science eventually caught up. By the early 20th century, doctors could diagnose hemophilia more precisely. They couldn't cure it, but they understood it. And the connection to Queen Victoria was no longer a whisper. It was fact. This changed everything. Suddenly, royal families had to think harder about matches. A princess with Victoria's blood was no longer just a dynastic gift. She was a genetic risk. And for the first time, science began to push back against dynasty. You step out of the corridor now, the ghost of silk slippers and stained gauze trailing behind. The era of ceremonial medicine is ending. But the damage had already been done, because in their obsession with bloodlines, the royals had created something tragically poetic, blood that could no longer hold itself together. You now find yourself in a drawing room of sepia photographs and creased telegrams. The air is thick with incense and empire lace curtains, ivory-handled fans, and portraits of 9 royal children staring back at you with solemn, identical faces. At the heart of it all sits Queen Victoria, matriarch, monarch, and unknowingly, genetic ground zero for the bleeding that would haunt Europe's royal houses. Tonight, you're not just meeting a queen. You're meeting a carrier. Victoria was born in 1819, daughter of Prince Edward and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. There were no signs of anything unusual in her own health. She wasn't sickly. She didn't bleed excessively. In fact, she lived to 81 and was, by royal standards, robust. But she carried something silent and X-linked, mutation that would echo across generations like a curse in formal wear. Mainstream historical fact: Queen Victoria's second son, Prince Leopold, was the first known royal diagnosed with hemophilia. He lived cautiously, required constant supervision, and eventually died at age 30 after slipping and hitting his head. It was a tragic but manageable secret until Victoria's daughters married. 3 of her daughters, Alice, Beatrice, and possibly Helena, passed the gene onto multiple European dynasties. You trace the thread like red silk across the continent: Germany, Spain, and most fatefully, Russia. That's how a quiet English queen ended up shaping the fate of the Romanovs. You pause before a photograph of Victoria in her widow's veil, hand resting on a cane, eyes heavy with the weight of a continent. She had no idea what she was unleashing. The science didn't exist yet. Genes were still abstract. What she did understand was duty, marriage, and the relentless math of empire. Marry daughters well. Marry them often, and the realm survives. Historians still argue whether Victoria's advisors ever realized the danger. There's no record of warning, no whisper of hesitation. Only celebration when her daughters wed foreign princes. It was considered a triumph, and for a while it was. Quirky fact: Because of all these matches, Victoria earned the nickname Grandmother of Europe. By World War I, her grandchildren and great-grandchildren sat on the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, Norway, Romania, and Spain. That's not a family tree, it's a dynasty-shaped spiderweb. But with that influence came vulnerability. The more her blood spread, the more it thinned the walls between monarchies and medical disaster. Consider Princess Alice, Victoria's daughter. She married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse. Their son Prince Friedrich had hemophilia. He died at age 2 after a fall from a window bleeding internally. Alice never recovered from the grief. Years later, she died of diphtheria, but not before witnessing the slow disintegration of her family's health. And then came Princess Beatrice, another daughter of Victoria. She married Prince Henry of Battenberg. Their son, Leopold Mountbatten, also had hemophilia. He lived longer, but died during a hip operation bled out on the table. You see the pattern now. This wasn't a rumor. It was a documented inheritance, and no royal title could shield them from it. But the most haunting chapter of Victoria's legacy unfolds in Russia. Alex of Hesse, Victoria's granddaughter, married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and became Empress Alexandra. She was devoted, serious, deeply religious, and a carrier of hemophilia. Her son, Alexei, was the long-awaited male heir to the Romanov dynasty, and he was born with the bleeding disease. You'll meet him soon. But for now, know this. Alexandra's desperation to save her son led her into the arms of Rasputin, the so-called mad monk who claimed mystical healing powers. Her reliance on him caused deep political tension in the Russian court and contribute indirectly but undeniably to the fall of the Romanovs, all because of a single gene mutation, likely beginning with Queen Victoria. Historians still debate where Victoria's mutation came from. Some suggest it was spontaneous, a random error during her father's conception. After all, there's no evidence of hemophilia in the British royal family before her. Others argue there may have been hidden carriers, women who passed the gene, without knowing, whose sons died young and unrecorded. But the result is the same. Victoria passed hemophilia through some of the most powerful houses in the world. And those houses, so obsessed with dynastic control, couldn't control the slow leak from within. Quirky aside, Victoria wrote more than 60 million words in letters and diaries over her lifetime. In all that ink, hemophilia is mentioned only a few times, always delicately, almost guiltily, as if she sensed the shadow she cast. You pause before one of her final letters. The handwriting is shaky. She writes to her daughter Beatrice, "My darling boy must be so careful." There are bruises. Again, that's all. No elaboration. No lament. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a danger passed down like a crown. And so, as you step back from the drawing room, from the ivory carriages and royal medals, one truth lingers. Victoria united Europe by blood, but that same blood became a ticking time bomb, silently flowing through veins too proud to speak its name. You open a tall door into a grand nursery where the walls are soft blue, the drapes velvet, and the silence is absolute. In the center, under a polished gold mobile shaped like cherubs and double-headed eagles, rests a cradle. Inside lies Alexei Romanov, heir to the Russian Empire, an empire he would never rule, undone by something smaller than any enemy the Tsars had ever faced: his blood. Alexei Nikolaevich, son of Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna, was born in 1904 after 4 daughters. His birth was greeted with overwhelming relief. The Romanovs finally had an heir. Guns fired in celebration. Bells rang across Moscow. But only a few weeks in, there were quiet worries. He bruised easily, cried in pain for no obvious reason. And then came the worst moment. A simple bump led to deep internal bleeding. Doctors confirmed what Alexandra had already feared in her bones. Her son had hemophilia. The royal disease passed from her grandmother, Queen Victoria. Mainstream. Historical fact. Alexei's condition was severe. He was classified as a hemophiliac of the highest grade, meaning even minor injuries could lead to internal bleeding, joint damage, or death. The Tsarina became obsessed with his safety. Guards were ordered to pad furniture. Horses were forbidden. Playmates were monitored constantly. You imagine Alexandra pacing this very nursery, watching her son sleep, waiting for signs of another episode. Sleep never came easy. Peace never lasted long. Historians still argue whether Nicholas and Alexandra's overprotectiveness ultimately isolated them from the Russian people. They withdrew from court life, canceled events, hid their son's illness from the press. But in hiding it, they fueled rumors. Some believed Alexei was possessed. Others thought he had seizures or a secret twin. The truth was simpler and sadder. He was just a boy with fragile veins, and into this vacuum of understanding stepped a man in robes and beard, Grigory Rasputin. Quirky fact. Rasputin was not a doctor. He was a mystic, a wanderer, and a peasant with striking eyes and questionable hygiene. And yet, when Alexei bled, Rasputin prayed, and the bleeding stopped. Multiple times. It wasn't magic, of course, but some. Historians suggest Rasputin's calming presence may have indirectly helped by lowering Alexei's blood pressure, or that he urged stopping harsh treatments like aspirin, which ironically worsens bleeding. To Alexandra, this was proof. Rasputin was a holy man sent to protect her son. She wrote, "Our friend has saved our boy again." She clung to him, trusted his advice, and let him influence decisions far beyond medicine. This, as you can guess, went very badly. Rasputin's closeness to the royal family caused scandal after scandal. Nobles whispered, newspapers mocked, enemies multiplied. And while Alexei quietly struggled upstairs, his parents were losing control of the throne downstairs, all because of a gene. You pause in front of a framed photo. Alexei in military garb, barely 10 years old, holding a small saber he would never wield in battle. His face is pale, his eyes tired. But there's a hint of joy. Perhaps he'd had a good day. A rare day without pain. As he grew older, his condition worsened. One fall, just a carriage jostling over a cobblestone, led to weeks of agony. His joints swelled. He couldn't walk. He screamed through the night. At one point, priests were summoned for last rites. The Tsar, already a poor decision-maker, was paralyzed by guilt and grief. The empire was crumbling. Strikes, wars, revolutionaries, and he couldn't leave his son's bedside. Meanwhile, Alexandra refused to remove Rasputin from court, deepening the political unrest. Historians still debate the butterfly effect here. If Alexei had been healthy, would the Romanovs have acted more boldly? Would they have engaged with reform? Would they have resisted revolution more effectively? Maybe, or maybe not. But what's certain is this: Alexei's bleeding shaped an empire's fate. Quirky side note. During World War I, Alexei begged to join his father at the front. He wanted to be a soldier, wanted to serve. But everyone knew he couldn't survive a scratch. So they gave him a miniature uniform and let him pretend. When the revolution came, there were no exceptions. The royal family was placed under house arrest in 1917, first in their palace, then in Siberia. Alexei was 13. His health continued to deteriorate. Confined, bleeding, and without treatment, He spent his final year in silence and confinement. And then, in 1918, came the night of execution. In the basement of a house in Yekaterinburg, Alexei was shot alongside his parents and sisters. He didn't die immediately. Reports suggest the bullets bounced off his jewel-lined shirt, ironically, designed by his mother to protect him from injury. Eventually, the assassins had to shoot him point-blank in the head. That's how the line ended. A child who couldn't stop bleeding. A family who couldn't stop hiding. An empire that couldn't stop falling. You stand in the center of the nursery. Once more, it's empty now, just sunlight and stillness. But the weight remains, because behind all the palaces and crowns and coats of arms was a boy who just wanted to play, and a body that wouldn't let him. You step into a vaulted ballroom now, where chandeliers hang like frozen fireworks and marble pillars glow with 1,000 candlelit reflections. But tonight, this isn't a celebration, it's a wedding, a royal one. And as the music swells, and the velvet-clad guests smile politely, you start noticing something. Odd, everyone here looks vaguely the same. You glance from bride to groom, to distant uncle, to bored flower girl. Similar eyes, repeated chins. That one guy? Definitely in. At least 3 family portraits. This isn't just a wedding. It's a family reunion with vows. And no one dares say what everyone is thinking. They're all related. Welcome to the great European tradition of interdynastic weddings, where kings married cousins, queens married nephews, and the whole court held its breath, praying this particular genetic spin wouldn't end in disaster. Mainstream historical fact. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the royal families of Europe were so interconnected, it became nearly impossible to find a monarch who wasn't already someone's cousin, or more awkwardly, someone's uncle-in-law and second cousin once removed. The Habsburgs were masters of this art, but by the 19th century, the Bourbons, the Romanovs, and even the British Windsors, still called the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha at the time, were all tangled together like a dinner. Party guest list written in mirror script. You pause beside an actual seating chart for the wedding of Alfonso, 13 of Spain, and Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg. She was Queen Victoria's granddaughter. He was her great-great-grandson. That makes them, well, let's just say someone in the family needed a whiteboard. The match was strategic. Alfonso needed a bride with noble blood, but no strong political claims. Victoria Eugenie was perfect, except she was a carrier of hemophilia. Doctors warned him. He married her anyway. Their sons. 2 of them inherited the disease. Historians still debate whether this marriage was a fatal political misstep or simply another instance of ignoring medical red flags for dynastic sparkle. Either way, the pattern holds. Royal families, faced with a shallow gene pool, just kept swimming in circles. Quirky fact: at some weddings, guests would play a game quietly referred to as "How are they related?" It was less icebreaker, more genealogical Sudoku, where the prize was the knowledge that, somehow, no one here was technically a stranger, and the more the families intermarried, the harder it became to distinguish alliances from entanglements. One British princess was married to a German duke who was also her godfather and her third cousin. Another royal bride attended her wedding escorted by both of her grandfathers, who were brothers. You lean against a pillar, watching the imagined ceremony unfold. The groom kisses the bride. The guests applaud. But beneath the surface, there's tension. Not just the awkwardness of yet another cousin union, but a deeper unease. Will this match produce an heir who survives? Because the stakes were always biological and political. An heir meant stability. No heir or worse, a sickly one meant civil unrest, power vacuums, and revolutions whispering at the palace gates. Sometimes the line got so thin, so warped, that monarchs married the only option left, their nieces. You may recall Philip IV of Spain, who married his own sister's daughter. Their son, Charles II, yes, that Charles II was the result. That wedding was attended by relatives so intertwined it looked more like a last-ditch attempt at royal Jenga than a celebration. Historians still argue whether these families saw the danger and pushed forward anyway, or whether they were just so conditioned by centuries of dynastic planning that no one questioned the logic anymore. To the royals, marrying within the bloodline wasn't perverse, it was noble. Purity of lineage was considered divine. Bringing in an outsider, that risked diluting the blood, or worse, inviting foreign influence. Quirky detail: royal blood was sometimes believed to be physically different, thicker, richer, imbued with God's favor. Physicians in the 1600s actually conducted experiments comparing noble and peasant blood. Spoiler, it's all red, but perception was everything. A pure bloodline meant divine right. And so the weddings went on, even when guests whispered, even when babies didn't survive, even when madness bloomed behind royal doors. You wander past a display of wedding gifts from various courts, gilded mirrors, jeweled tiaras, and an odd clock shaped like an eagle sent from one cousin to another. The note attached: "May your union strengthen our family and our thrones." It didn't mention knees that would swell or tongues that would not fit in the mouth, because in these halls, form mattered more than function. The pageantry masked the problems. A royal bride glowing in satin distracted from the fact that her family tree looked more like a wreath. You take a last look at the imaginary wedding before stepping away. The music fades. The guests disperse. The bride and groom pose for portraits that will hang for centuries, even as their story fades. And as you walk down the corridor, one quiet thought follows. They married for power. But what they passed down again and again was fragility. You descend a worn marble staircase now, each step echoing with the slow crumble of something once grand. At the bottom, you enter a room lit by thin shafts of daylight slanting through high, cracked windows. There's little furniture here, just portraits, dark-eyed, pale-faced monarchs of Spain, each looking more weary than the last. Welcome to the Spanish Habsburg's dynasty of decline, a family line that didn't just falter. It withered. This wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a generational slow-motion unraveling caused by loyalty to a single sacred principle: keep the blood pure. And nowhere was this principle pursued with more zeal or more tragic results than in Spain. Mainstream historical fact. From the early 1500s to the early 1700s, the Habsburg kings of Spain engaged in systematic close-kin marriage, often between uncle and niece or first cousins. By the end of the line, they weren't just maintaining a dynasty, they were exhausting it. You glance at a family tree carved in wood on the wall. It doesn't branch so much as loop. From Charles V to Philip II to Philip III and IV to Charles. Each generation draws from the same narrow pool. Not only were they repeating names, they were repeating chromosomes. The faces in the portraits reflect this. Charles V, already sporting the infamous Habsburg jaw. Philip II, a man of rigid routine and reported emotional detachment. Philip III, sweet, polite, and politically ineffective. Philip IV, thoughtful, artistic, but distracted. And finally, Charles II, the tragic child king who was both the product and the symbol of the dynasty's decay. Historians still debate whether the decline of Spanish power was caused primarily by this inbreeding, or whether it was compounded by other factors: overextension of empire, inflation from New World silver, or religious rigidity. But the biological toll is undeniable. Take Philip III, who married his first cousin, Margaret of Austria. They had 8 children. Of those, only a few lived beyond childhood, and even fewer reached adulthood in full health. His son, Philip IV, also married his niece. Their offspring? Charles II, of course, whose story you've already heard. And that alone tells you how narrow the family pipeline had become. Quirky aside, there was a running joke in European courts that Spain no longer needed marriage alliances, they could just recycle their own family. Not so funny when you realize it was mostly true, but the rot wasn't just physical. It was mental, political, and administrative. The kings became increasingly withdrawn, delegated more power to favorites and advisors. The court became ceremonial, hollow, overly religious. Decisions were delayed, alliances weakened. The mighty Spanish Armada, once the terror of the seas, was defeated and not rebuilt. Colonies rebelled. Revenues dried up. And behind it all, the family tree continued tightening. You move past a display of medical records copies, mostly scrawled in Latin and archaic Castilian. They read like warnings from the body: chronic fatigue, tremors, delayed speech, joint weakness, melancholia. Some describe multiple miscarriages. Others, children who were born mute or without breath or simply deformed. By the mid-1600s, even some members of the court were quietly expressing concern not about the politics, but the biology. One physician wrote in a private letter, "The blood is noble, yes, but it is also thin and cold." Another warned that, without new stock, the dynasty would fade like a candle in the fog. But tradition is a powerful drug, and the Habsburgs were nothing if not devoted to their traditions. You sit for a moment on a carved wooden bench. The silence here isn't peaceful. It's the silence of a line that ran out of road. You picture a royal wedding procession. Trumpets, banners, crowds cheering, and no one daring to say aloud they're too closely related. Because the alternative, breaking the pattern, was unthinkable. In 1665, Charles II took throne. His reign was a slow, painful final act. No heirs, no strength. Spain drifted while rivals France, England, the Dutch Republic grew bolder. The empire that once ruled the Americas, the Philippines, much of Italy, and the Low Countries was now ruled by a man who couldn't chew solid food or read complex documents. Quirky fact: in his final will, Charles II asked his court not to autopsy his body. He was afraid the findings would shame the dynasty. Of course, they did it anyway. And the report? It's a litany of horrors. Heart the size of a peppercorn, head full of water, body without blood. Whether exaggerated or not, it reads like a metaphor carved in flesh. And when Charles died in 1700, the Habsburg line in Spain died with him. There were no male heirs, no cousins left with strong enough claims. A European crisis erupted, the War of the Spanish Succession, a continent scrambling to inherit the spoils of a family that had been too exclusive for too long. You walk past the last portrait. It's cracked, dusty, no smile. Just tired eyes and a mouth half open, like he's still trying to speak, and maybe he is. Because what the Spanish Habsburgs leave behind isn't just a cautionary tale about family trees. It's a quiet whisper that even the greatest empires can fall not with a bang, but with a family dinner table that gets smaller and smaller until there's no one left to pull up a chair. You step out of Spain's dim corridor and into the echoing marble halls of Vienna, where the chandeliers are grander, the portraits even more solemn, and the air hums with a finality you can't quite name. This is the Austrian Habsburg endgame, chapter of powdered wigs, tight-laced bloodlines, and the slow death of one of Europe's most infamous dynasties. By now, you know the script: marry cousins, produce heirs. Ignore the warning signs. But here in Vienna, things play out with one last flourish, a finale more tragic than majestic. The Austrian Habsburgs had clung to power through marriage for centuries. Their motto might as well have been, "Why fight a war when you can marry?" A niece, and it worked for a while. The empire expanded. The court glittered. But beneath the brocade was the same creeping problem. Genealogy doubling back on itself. Mainstream historical fact. From the 1500s to the 1700s, the Austrian Habsburgs engaged in the same close-kin marriages as their Spanish cousins. And by the time of Leopold I, the signs of degeneration were fully visible: chronic illness, stillbirths, mental disabilities, and facial deformities passed down like heirlooms. You stop before a portrait of Emperor Leopold I, his face partially hidden by a heavy mustache, but the jaw still unmistakably Habsburg. He married 3 times. 2 of his wives were cousins. The third was also related. It's a family tradition like bad cooking, only it bleeds. One of Leopold's sons, Joseph I, seemed healthy but died of smallpox young. Another, Charles VI, fared better, but his only surviving child, a daughter, Maria Theresa. She matters soon. For now, focus on this. By the early 1700s, the male Habsburg line was out of gas. Historians still argue whether this collapse was purely genetic or whether it was compounded by war, famine, and bad luck. But the numbers don't lie. Fewer births, more deaths, weaker heirs. The great Habsburg line wasn't cut down, it withered from within. Quirky aside, Vienna's court physicians began creating health charts to track which noble families had the least compromised blood. It was basically an 18th century Yelp for uterus quality. Grim but telling. You walk beneath a fresco depicting the marriage carousel, a round dance of noble couples, each spinning toward another throne. The Habsburgs rode it longer than anyone. But by Maria Theresa's time, the dance floor was nearly empty. And then surprise, a glimmer of hope. Maria Theresa, the only surviving child of Charles VI, inherited the throne through the Pragmatic Sanction, a special legal document that bent centuries of male-only succession rules. She wasn't supposed to rule, but she did. And brilliantly, you see her now in oil, poised, intelligent, surrounded by her 16 children. Yes, 16. And in a twist so steeped in irony, it deserves a crown of its own. She tried to reverse the trend. She arranged marriages outside the tightest cousin circles. Not because she understood genetic science wasn't there yet, but because she wanted stability, and maybe, unconsciously, some fresh DNA. Among her children, Marie Antoinette, the future Queen of France. Joseph II, her heir, who pushed for reforms and abolished serfdom. And yet, the shadow lingered. Despite her efforts, hemophilia and other conditions still appeared. And her children still married other cousins, even if they were slightly less closely related. The dynasty was trying to change lanes on a road that looped back into itself. You pause at a glass case. Inside, a letter from Maria Theresa to her daughter Maria Carolina. It reads, "May your husband bring strength to your children, and not the sickness we have seen in our line." That's not a queen. That's a mother, worried the ghosts in the blood will follow. But time was running out. As the 18th century drew to a close, revolutions rippled across Europe. France guillotined its royals. Prussia eyed Vienna with envy. And the Habsburgs? They tried to adapt, but with feet in too many centuries. The Holy Roman Empire was dissolving. The emperors were aging. And behind closed doors, the heirs were increasingly weak, physically and politically. One of the final nails, Emperor Ferdinand I, who ruled from 1835 to 1848. He suffered from epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and reported intellectual disabilities. His famously mumbled line during the bread riot, "Must I rule?" Even he knew something was broken. Quirky detail? His favorite activity was collecting mechanical toys. He once interrupted a council meeting to show off a clockwork duck. The empire, meanwhile, was already spiraling toward revolution. Ferdinand was eventually forced to abdicate. The throne passed to Franz Joseph, who ruled longer but spent much of his reign patching cracks that were never meant to hold. By the time World War I arrived, the once mighty Habsburg Empire was overextended, outdated, and hollowed out, more a memory than a power. You reached the final portrait. Charles I, the last Emperor of Austria, crowned in 1916. He reigned barely 2 years. The war ended. The empire shattered. The dynasty collapsed. No assassins, no uprisings in Vienna. Just an ending centuries in the making, carried in the blood. Of men who married their nieces, and of women who bore children that history would not let forget. And so, you step out into the cool Viennese night. The chandeliers are dim now, the halls behind you empty. The Habsburgs, who once ruled half of Europe, vanished with a whisper, all because no one ever stopped to ask, what happens when the blood gets too pure to carry a crown? You step through a narrow passage now, barely wide enough for 2 cloaked courtiers to brush past in silence. At the end, a door, heavy, bolted, unmarked, a door not meant to be found. Tonight, you open it, not for scandal, not for whispers, but to meet the forgotten children of Europe's royal courts. The one's history buried behind curtains and locked rooms, because while the crowns dazzled and the portraits preened, behind the scenes, some royal offspring were born with disabilities, physical, cognitive, or neurological, and instead of being embraced, they were hidden. This isn't about a single dynasty. It happened across Europe, from Vienna to Versailles, from London to Lisbon. Any child who didn't meet the unspoken standard of noble perfection was quietly removed from the public eye, sometimes from the family entirely. Mainstream historical fact: royal records from the 17th to 19th centuries show an abnormally high number of unnamed or underdocumented children, usually infants or toddlers, listed in palace birth registries, then disappearing. Historians believe many were born with birth defects or developmental delays and were either institutionalized, placed in remote estates, or simply allowed to vanish from the record. You glance around the room now, dim nursery with worn velvet drapes, faded toys, and a chill that has nothing to do with the air. This is where some of them might have lived, not out of cruelty, always, but out of shame and fear, and the relentless belief that kings and queens must not be flawed. And here's the cruel irony. Inbreeding made these outcomes more likely. Close kin. Marriages increase the risk of recessive genetic disorders, some visible, like clubfoot or cleft palate, others invisible but no less debilitating. Royal families, especially the Habsburgs and Bourbons, produce children with facial asymmetries, cognitive impairments, or conditions that we now recognize as forms of autism, epilepsy, or even cerebral palsy. But without modern understanding, these children were often labeled as possessed, touched, or simply unfit. And so they disappeared. Quirky fact: one 18th century French noblewoman, the Duchesse de Polignac, kept a detailed guestbook of Versailles visitors. In one margin, she notes, "The Spanish envoy's 4th child, never shown rumors of weak limbs." Even casual gossip kept track of invisible heirs. You lean over a writing desk where faint, hurried script records a birth. No name, no weight. Just a symbol, a tiny X beside the mother's name. The footnote? withdrawn from presentation. That meant the child would not appear before court, would not be painted, would not, in most cases, be spoken of again. Historians still argue how many royal children were hidden this way. Some suggest it was rare, an exaggeration. Others believe it was far more common, with courtiers, midwives, and clerics all complicit in crafting a seamless narrative for the outside world. In Vienna, it's whispered that Emperor Ferdinand I wasn't the only Habsburg with severe epilepsy. But the others? No portraits, no papers. Just gaps in the tree. In Spain, letters from courtiers mention a child of Philip V who never learned to speak and was best kept in the south wing. No further records. Just soft echoes through lace. And in England, even Queen Victoria's own family may have shielded disability. Two of her great-granddaughters, Nerissa and Catherine Boleyn, were institutionalized and falsely recorded as deceased for decades. They were never visited, never acknowledged. Their existence for a long time was treated as an inconvenient rumor, not a family fact. Quirky aside, some palaces had entire wings for invalid royals, complete with their own staff and gardens. These were not dungeons, but they were prisons of silence. You sit now in a faded velvet chair, imagining what it must have been like to be born royal, but not enough. To hear the distant trumpets, the ceremonies, the laughter at court, all while being told you'd never wear a sash, never meet ambassadors, never be painted, and perhaps saddest of all, these children were often loved quietly by their mothers, but publicly denied. The royal image could not crack, so the parents grieved silently, bowed to protocol, and followed the court physician's recommendation: remove the child. You trace your hand along a bookcase filled with medical notes. Terms like imbecile, idiota, feeble-minded leap off the page. Cruel language by today's standards, but standard then. They weren't interested in understanding. They were interested in containment. Historians still debate whether some of these children might have thrived today with education, therapy, or simply dignity. And the answer is, heartbreakingly, yes, because many were not monsters or lost causes. They were simply different, born into a world that had no room for imperfection on a throne. You step out of the hidden room and seal the door behind you. The hush follows. But so does the truth. For every crown and scepter you've seen on this journey, there's a story not told. A child not named. A life not counted. And in the quietest corners of Europe's palaces, those echoes still live. You find yourself in a quieter chamber, now modest by palace standards, but with heavy tapestries and a thick scent of wax polish in the air. There's a strange stillness here, like you've stepped into a memory the royal family would rather forget. This is the room of the Habsburg lip and the increasingly foggy minds that came with it. Tonight, you're not here for a crown or a coronation. You're here to meet rulers who slurred their commands, who fumbled at banquets, who sometimes couldn't remember where they were or even who they were. And most of them, you'll notice, had one thing in common: the face. That infamous Habsburg lip, technically mandibular prognathism, was more than just a jawline. It was a diagnostic flag, a sign that the family's tightly wound genes were not just affecting their profiles, but possibly their brains. Mainstream historical fact: the Habsburgs were genetically isolated for so long that by the time Charles II of Spain was born, remember him, he wasn't just physically frail, he was cognitively impaired. But Charles wasn't an outlier. Several Habsburgs displayed signs of neurological issues, seizures, speech problems, memory lapses. And in a family where cousin marriage was the default, these issues began to pile up. You paused before a set of bust sculptures of Habsburg, Rulers lined up in a row like a gallery of increasingly misunderstood ancestors. The first few, sharp, symmetrical. The last, distorted jaw, heavy. Lower lip, eyes that seem half lost in thought. They don't just look different, they feel different. And here's where things get murky. Historians still argue whether the mental fog many of these royals experienced was directly caused by inbreeding. There are theories, sure, but medical records from the 16th and 17th centuries were less than thorough. Doctors noted melancholia, confusion, fits, and weakness of the mind, all vague phrases that could describe anything from epilepsy to depression to dementia. What we do know is that neurological conditions do cluster in inbred populations. Genetic bottlenecks increase the likelihood of certain rare disorders being expressed, including forms of epilepsy, developmental delays, and even neurodegenerative diseases. Quirky detail? Charles II's speech was so unclear at times, courtiers reportedly developed a system of guesswork, nodding agreeing to whatever they thought he meant. His council was less a cabinet and more a team of royal translators. But Charles wasn't the only one. Emperor Ferdinand I of Austria, centuries later, also suffered from what his doctors politely called weakness of intellect. He had frequent seizures. He stammered. He often repeated phrases. And yet, he ruled for 13 years. You pass an ornate chair with straps hidden in the armrests. It was said to be designed for a Habsburg prince who had difficulty sitting. Still, during court functions, some called it a throne. Others whispered it was a restraint. Quirky aside, in some portraits, painters subtly edited the lips and jaws of their royal patrons, adding beard curls, angling the pose anything to obscure the telltale Habsburg profile. And when the subject couldn't close their mouth fully, they simply painted it partially hidden behind a lace handkerchief. Problem solved. In oil. The irony, of course, is that these were not unintelligent families. Many Habsburg rulers were multilingual, deeply educated, and genuinely interested in philosophy, theology, and the sciences. But education couldn't outrun biology. And by the 1700s, court tutors were reportedly spending more time trying to manage behavior than teach material. One diary from a royal tutor in Madrid includes the line, "His Highness becomes distracted by his own fingers and weeps when the window is opened." That's not a failing of manners. That's a child overwhelmed by the world, likely living with undiagnosed sensory or cognitive challenges. And yet, these children were placed on thrones, given armies, asked to approve treaties, because to do otherwise would have meant admitting the system was broken. Historians still debate how aware the courts were of the full extent of mental decline. Some believe it was openly acknowledged behind closed doors. Others think denial ran so deep that any behavior could be explained away as divine mystery or eccentricity. You stop in front of a mirror ornate, gold-trimmed, and slightly warped. You can almost imagine a Habsburg prince, aged 15, staring into it, practicing speeches, trying to say his own name without slurring, knowing that people notice his jaw first, that they nod when he speaks, even if they don't understand. And you wonder, what must it feel like to inherit a world, but not quite know how to command it? One final note. The Habsburgs weren't alone. The Bourbon family of France also had recurring rumors of mental decline. Some Romanovs showed signs of emotional instability. It wasn't always inbreeding, but when it was, it amplified the issues that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. So as you leave this quiet, forgotten room of restrained chairs and altered portraits, a new thought lingers behind the silk drapes. The royal families of Europe didn't just inherit thrones. They inherited expectations their bodies and minds could no longer meet. And rather than adapt, they insisted on pretending until the illusion itself broke. You step into a long gallery, now no portraits this time, just candlelight flickering across a polished wood table where parchment maps, dusty volumes, and scattered letters have been laid out like evidence in a trial. This is the place where history itself hesitates, where scholars lean in, fingers steepled, voices low. Because tonight, you're sitting at the same table where generations of historians have asked, was it really madness, or was it something else entirely? You've already met kings who spoke to trees, queens who hid their bleeding children, and emperors whose jaws betrayed their lineage. But now, we look past the diagnosis, past the symptoms, and into the lingering question, what did madness mean to royalty, and who got to decide? Mainstream historical fact. For centuries, European monarchs who displayed signs of erratic behavior, be it manic episodes, delusions, depression, or neurological tremors, were almost universally labeled as mad. But the term itself was so vague, so politically charged, that even today, historians can't always agree on what was real and what was reputation. You scan a series of case files left open on the table. Not medical records, those were often destroyed or misplaced, but letters, memoirs, and court gossip. There's George III, whose eloquence crumbled into rambling monologues. Madness, yes, but now suspected to be porphyria or bipolar disorder. There's Joanna of Castile, known to history as Juana la Loca. She mourned her husband obsessively, reportedly carried his coffin with her across Spain. Mad with grief, or just grieving without permission? And then there's Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king who built castles inspired by Wagner operas and was eventually declared insane by a committee, none of whom had ever met him. Was he mentally unfit or just inconvenient? Historians still argue whether many royal madness diagnoses were genuine or simply tools of control. After all, if a king made bad decisions or a queen refused marriage, it was easier to call them mad than to admit weakness, dissent, or heaven forbid human emotion. Quirky aside, in some royal courts, physicians developed coded language to report on mental decline. Clouds gathering in the north meant delusions. Unquiet temperament meant mania. One note about a 17th century Habsburg prince simply read, "The candle burns faster than the wax allows." You pause at a bound volume, a study of Maria I of Portugal, often dubbed Maria the Mad. She suffered intense religious anxiety, heard voices, and was eventually institutionalized. But she also ruled competently for years and founded schools. Was she unwell or overwhelmed? And if she were male, would her breakdown have been dismissed as spiritual fervor or battlefield stress? You begin to notice a pattern. Many so-called mad royals were women or younger sons, those with power but not too much power. Convenient targets. Diagnosing them with madness allowed others to step in, advise, or take over altogether. And then there's the Habsburg pattern. Again, their court physicians became famous and feared for declaring rulers unfit. Yet, these were often the same men who approved uncle-niece marriages. You see the contradiction. A king drooling into his soup was still fit to rule until he disagreed with policy. Then suddenly he was mad, safely tucked away in a monastery with a cousin sliding into his throne. Historians still debate how much self-awareness some royals had about their own conditions. Charles VI of France famously believed he was made of glass and refused to let anyone touch him. But he could still sign edicts, attend mass, hold court. Was he mad, or simply suffering from what we'd now call a psychotic disorder? And doing his best? Quirky fact: during one period in 15th century France, The royal court built a custom suit of padded armor for Charles VI, just in case he shattered. His attendants were trained in glass care. It sounds absurd, but to Charles, it was protection. You turn a page and find a quote from an Austrian chamberlain. His Majesty walks in circles now. He speaks to no one but the mirror. We pretend not to hear. It is safer this way. That's not a diagnosis. That's a strategy, because madness in a monarch wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a national emergency. If a king went mad, wars might start. Treaties might unravel. Revolutions might ignite. So the goal wasn't always to help the monarch, it was to manage the illusion. And often, the illusion held. Longer than it should. You glance toward the corner of the room where an empty throne-shaped chair waits under a dust cloth. No one sits there, not anymore. But you can almost hear the whispers. He's just tired. She's deep in prayer. There, reflecting on the burdens of the crown. And maybe, just maybe, they were. Because what we now call anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, PTSD, these were never invented. They just had different names, and royals were not immune. They just had better costumes. You take one last look around. The gallery of silent madness, both real and rumored. Some kings probably were unwell, others gaslit by history. But all of them lived in a world where the line between eccentric and insane was drawn by power dot, and that line, more often than not, was written in ink by someone with perfectly steady hands. You leave behind the cold diagnoses and candlelit files, and now you find yourself ascending into a grand echoing hall, tall windows, marble busts, velvet-lined benches. This is the royal gallery of myths, of symbols, of appearances carefully curated. Because tonight, you're not here to examine a body or a mind. You're here to examine an idea, one more enduring than any dynasty, the myth of blue blood. You've heard the phrase, maybe even used it, but tonight we peel it back. Because in Europe, blue blood wasn't just a nickname for nobles, it was a worldview, a self-made religion of biology woven deep into the fabric of monarchy. Mainstream historical fact, the term sangre azul, or blue blood, originated in medieval Spain, used by old aristocratic families to distinguish themselves from people with Moorish or Jewish ancestry. The nobles, supposedly untainted by intermarriage with those of darker skin, claimed their blood appeared bluer beneath pale, translucent skin. Thus, blue blood. You roll your eyes maybe. But for royalty, it wasn't just a pigment myth, it was gospel. Blue blood meant divine origin. The closer you kept it, through cousin marriages, niece brides, and carefully engineered matches, the more sacred, noble, and superior you remained. Historians still debate whether monarchs truly believed this nonsense, or whether they simply used it to justify their terrible family trees. Probably both. But the result was centuries of marriage decisions made on the illusion of visible purity. Quirky aside, in 16th century France, some noblewomen would apply blue-tinted makeup to enhance their vain visibility. The goal? Appear more noble by looking like your circulatory system was closer to sapphire than red. You step closer to an oil painting of a young king hand on his chest, gaze to heaven, veins faintly visible along the wrist. A symbol of divine origin. But what you now know is that wrist may have hidden the beginnings of hemophilia. That noble jaw may have barely moved when he tried to speak. Because blue blood, for all its mystique, was just oxygen-poor venous blood viewed through pale skin. No different from yours. No more regal than a village baker's. Still, the idea stuck. Entire family lines built their identity on it. They didn't just rule, they embodied superiority, ordained not just by God, but by their very biology. And the tighter they kept that bloodline, the holier they thought they became. But let's remember where this got them. It got Spain a king who couldn't speak or chew. It got Austria an emperor who couldn't complete sentences. It got Russia an heir who couldn't survive a bruise. It got Britain and Germany tangled in a family feud so severe it helped ignite World War I. And yet, blue blood persisted. You pass a showcase of coronation regalia jewels, robes, and a long, ornate family tree etched in silver. It looks majestic. But you recognize the names now. You see where the branches double back, where the inbreeding deepens, where the children died young, or didn't die but never truly lived. Quirky fact? In some royal courts, bloodlines were charted more carefully than military plans. Entire departments, chanceries of nobility, were tasked with verifying lineage before a marriage could proceed. If your blood wasn't pure enough, the match was cancelled. Not because of love, but because of veins. And yet, not one of these rulers had actual blue blood. They bled red. They coughed, bruised, and died like anyone else. Sometimes faster. Still, the myth persists even today. You hear it in tabloids, royal DNA, noble stock, the blood of kings. It sells magazines, fuels documentaries, makes us think we're glimpsing something ancient and elevated. But if you've learned anything tonight, it's this: that royal blood was a house of mirrors, built on biology that collapsed the more they tried to preserve it. Historians still argue whether the blue blood myth was self-delusion or political genius. Maybe both. It gave monarchies an aura of untouchable distinction until the science caught up. And then it gave them a ticking genetic time bomb. You glance up now at a stained glass window, where the light turns the glass veins blue. It's beautiful, symbolic, and false, because power doesn't live in your blood. It lives in your mind, in your decisions, in your ability to grow, change, and let go of myths when they start to hurt the people they're meant to elevate. And as you step quietly out of the hall of blue blood, you leave the myth behind and carry with you the truth that sometimes chasing purity leads not to strength, but to slow, noble collapse. You cross into a colder, more austere chamber, now less gold, fewer silks, and far more maps. Scrolls are unfurled across long oak tables, each marked with names, dates, and marriage banns. Welcome to the room where royal genealogists played God, because when you've spent centuries marrying your cousins, eventually someone had to ask the uncomfortable question: who's still left to marry? This section isn't about romance. It's about desperation, about the moment when Europe's royal families realized that their obsession with blue blood had painted them into a biological corner, and their precious gene pools were starting to look more like puddles. Mainstream historical fact: by the 18th century, many European monarchies began to experience what modern scientists would call genetic saturation. There were so many interconnections between royal houses that the chances of pairing two people not already closely related were slim to none. You glance at a marriage chart, a real one from the Spanish court in 1700. It's not romantic. It looks like a war plan. Red lines cross out forbidden matches, siblings, uncle, niece, double cousins, but the margins are tight. There are fewer and fewer options. You hear the advisor sigh, perhaps someone from the lesser houses. That's when the panic started. Some royal houses began to look outward toward minor nobility, foreign duchies, or cadet branches long considered too low in status. Others, more desperate, asked the Vatican for dispensations to permit marriages previously considered incestuous by church law. And surprise, they usually got them. Quirky fact: the Catholic Church had rules against consanguinity going back to the early Middle Ages, but by the 1600s, it had granted over 3,000 marriage exemptions, many to royals. One Spanish king received special permission to marry his own niece. Because all other options had been exhausted, you pause before a massive book labeled Libro de Sangre. It lists royal blood purity levels across 5 generations. A Spanish princess once had to prove 128 noble ancestors before her marriage was approved. The twist? Many of them were the same people, listed twice because the family tree had folded in on itself. Historians still debate whether these bans and rules were meant to protect dynasties or simply preserve appearances. In theory, they were there to prevent exactly the kinds of genetic disasters you've been exploring all night. But in practice, the rules bent like wet parchment, and when they did bend, things got messy. You flipped to a page describing Charles IV of Spain, who married his first cousin. Their son Ferdinand VII also married a cousin. He later married his niece. By the time his daughter Isabella II took the throne, the family tree looked like it had been scribbled by a spider. And yes, Isabella's own marriage would later prompt genetic concerns. Some kingdoms responded by creating marriage councils. Their job? Vet every candidate by bloodline compatibility. Think Tinder, but with papal seals and charts of facial symmetry. And when someone outside the accepted bloodline showed up like a minor, Bavarian princess or a Prussian count's daughter, they were often rejected, not for lack of virtue, but for lack of noble blood concentration. Quirky aside, one Austrian archduchess was disqualified from marrying into the French court because her great-grandmother had been born out of wedlock to a baroness. That's how thin the margins were. Eventually, royal families started importing brides from farther afield Italy, Scandinavia, even the Balkans. But even those lines were often already touched by Habsburg or Bourbon blood, because those families had exported their children so effectively across Europe. So the problem wasn't just shallow gene pools. It was that every pool was connected to every other pool, like a system of leaking bathtubs. And then science happened. By the late 1800s, genetics began to explain what had long been whispered. Royal physicians and advisors could now connect hemophilia, deformities, and infant mortality with inbreeding. Theories of heredity, once vague, sharpened. Chromosomes were discovered. And suddenly, those messy charts became time bombs. Historians still argue how much real influence early science had on royal marriage decisions. Some monarchies tried to reform. Others ignored it entirely until it was too late. You glance now at a curious document, a letter from Queen Victoria herself, acknowledging concern about her descendants' health. She didn't name hemophilia, but she noted the weakened constitutions and frequent tragedy of her grandchildren. It's the closest thing to a royal oops. By the early 20th century, some monarchies began loosening their rules. Marriages between royals and aristocrats became more common. By mid-century, non-royal matches began to appear, and the gene pool, at long last, began to breathe again, but not before generations were sacrificed to charts, seals, and ceremonial logic. You sit back and imagine the advisors once seated in this very room. They didn't mean harm. They weren't villains. They were products of a system that believed blood could be too special to mix with anyone else's, and so they drew lines, crossed names off lists, made marriages that looked good on paper and collapsed in the cradle. And behind it all, this truth waited like a closing door. The more you try to preserve the crown in one family, the faster you risk losing the heads to wear it. You enter a vaulted room with faded tapestries and sun-warped portraits. The scent here is old parchment and candle soot, a place more archive than palace. This is Portugal. Or more precisely, the royal puzzle box of Portugal's dynasty, where kings and queens wrap themselves in cousin matches. so tight that their minds began to unravel long before their reigns did. Tonight, we meet Maria I of Portugal, a queen whose legacy is marked by piety, empire, and madness that history never truly untangled. Born in 1734, Maria was the daughter of King Joseph I of Portugal and Mariana Victoria of Spain, first cousins of course. When Joseph died, Maria became the first undisputed queen regnant of Portugal. And for a while, she ruled well, deeply religious, politically cautious, surrounded by trusted advisors. Mainstream historical fact: Maria's reign began with stability. She reigned in the harsh policies of her father's ministers, encouraged the arts, and was beloved by the public. But as the years went on, something in her began to fracture. First came the grief. Her husband, also her uncle, died in 1786. Her eldest son died the following year. Then her confessor passed away. 3 devastating losses in 3 years. For anyone, that's unbearable. But for Maria, it cracked something open. Soon she was weeping uncontrollably during court functions. Then came outbursts, confusion, religious hallucinations. She claimed she was damned, that demons surrounded her. At times, she screamed so loudly she had to be restrained. Masses were held for her sanity. Historians still argue whether Maria suffered from bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, or complicated grief-induced psychosis. But one thing they agree on: her mental state declined quickly and visibly, and it terrified the court. You pause beside her portrait. The eyes are gentle, the lips slightly parted in what might be worry. The painter softened her features, but the truth can't quite be hidden. She was struggling, even as she wore the crown. And here's the kicker: the royal family did what royal families always did. They hid her away. Behind silk screens, behind palace doors, eventually behind an ocean. Because in 1807, when Napoleon's armies threatened Portugal, the entire royal family fled to Brazil, establishing a temporary capital in Rio de Janeiro. Maria came to in a padded coach, rarely seen, nearly silent, though her screams were said to echo through the tropical nights. Quirky aside, Maria I ruled from Brazil for 8 years, the only European monarch to govern from a South American colony. But she didn't sign documents. She didn't hold court. Her son, Prince João, later João VI, acted as regent, effectively ruling in her name. The queen was only technically present, a monarch in title, but not in mind. You step into a smaller room now, her private chapel, recreated here. Gilded edges, a marble altar, a crucifix polished smooth from countless touches. Maria was obsessively religious. In her lucid moments, she prayed constantly, often for the souls of the damned. Sometimes, she believed she was among them. And while this may sound like the unraveling of one mind, it wasn't isolated. The Braganza dynasty, the ruling family of Portugal, had, like their Habsburg cousins, a habit of close intermarriage. Genetic bottlenecks were common. Epilepsy, mental illness, and fertility issues appeared throughout the line. Maria's father and husband were both her uncle. Her children would carry the same twisted legacy. Quirky fact: her son João, the de facto ruler during her illness, would later marry Carlota Joaquina, his own niece. And that marriage was so dysfunctional, their court became known more for scandal than statecraft. The dynasty didn't learn. They just kept passing the candle, even as it flickered. You scan the final years of Maria's life. She remained in Brazil until her death in 1816 at the age of 81. For more than 30 years, she had lived with severe mental illness longer than many monarchs ruled. She died still titled Queen, but her reign had effectively ended decades before. Historians still debate what could have been done differently. Was her collapse inevitable? Could early trauma have been managed if she hadn't also carried so much genetic weight? Would she have been remembered as Mad Maria if she'd been a man? The questions remain. What doesn't remain is her voice. She left behind no journals, no letters. Her story has been told through the voices of men who didn't understand her doctors, priests, sons, and nervous ministers. And through history books that often sum her up with one cruel adjective, insane. You step out of the recreated chapel, back into the archive light, and wonder, what if we'd known then what we know now? What if a queen could have grieved without shame, could have been treated with compassion, could have lived not as a mystery, but as a person? And what if just once the royal line had looked past the family tree and into the world beyond? Maybe then, Maria, I wouldn't be remembered for her silence. Maybe she would have been remembered for her voice. You step through a low stone arch into a room much smaller than the others. No velvet here. Just bare walls, a cracked clay floor, and a single worn chair in the corner. This was no throne room. This is where we meet a prince who never ruled, never married, and never left behind an heir, because he was never really expected to. Tonight, you meet Prince Juan of Castile, sometimes known simply as El Idiota, not in cruelty, but in quiet resignation. Juan was born in the early 16th century, a time when the Spanish Habsburgs were expanding rapidly in territory, wealth, and unfortunately, in consanguinity. He was the son of Joanna of Castile. Yes, Joanna the Mad and Philip the Handsome, who, frankly, didn't pass down the best genes. Their marriage was politically brilliant. Genetically, a ticking clock. Juan's early life was kept out of public view. Records from the time describe him as delicate, melancholic, and unsteady of spirit. As he aged, whispers grew louder. He didn't speak much, rarely smiled, and seemed unable to grasp even the most basic courtly etiquette. Tutors rotated frequently. Letters describe frustration, pity, and eventually avoidance. Mainstream historical fact. There is no formal diagnosis for Prince Juan. His short life is a puzzle of fragmented accounts, religious metaphors, and physician notes that use words like imbecilicus and gentle but vacant. He was never officially disinherited, but neither was he prepared for any role beyond existing. You pause before a crumbling document, a letter from a courtier to Queen Isabella. It reads, "The boy's health is unchanged. His words are few, and echo none of reason. I fear he shall be more burden than branch." It's heartbreaking, and it's also patterned. The Habsburgs were producing more children like Juan soft-eyed, silent, slow, as their genetic loops became tighter. Marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins, generation after generation, didn't just affect jaws and fertility. They altered minds. And worse, they blurred the royal court's ability to understand what was happening. Historians still argue whether Juan's condition was intellectual disability, a neurological disorder, or simply deep developmental delay caused by cumulative inbreeding. But what's clear is that no one knew how to care for him. So they did what royalty did best. They hid him. Quirky aside, despite his condition, Juan was still treated ceremonially as a prince. He had his own coat of arms. His meals were announced with trumpets. But when visiting nobles came calling, Juan was unwell at prayer, or tending to books, code for out of sight. You step through a small alcove now, where a child's wooden writing desk still stands. The inkwells are dry, the candle holder still stained with soot. This may have been where they tried to teach him letters, scripture, courtly speech. But the records suggest he never read or wrote fluently. Eventually, Juan was moved to a remote estate, still pampered, still fed from gold plates, but surrounded mostly by caretakers and monks. The family visited occasionally, though increasingly less so. As long as he was out of the line of succession, out of the public's eye, and out of the narrative, the court could breathe. But here's the twist. Juan was once considered a potential dynastic solution. In his early childhood, as Spain and Austria scrambled to unite their lines, there was talk of betrothing him to a cousin princess. The union would have preserved alliances, even if Juan himself could barely hold a conversation that it never happened, of course. The princess was sent elsewhere. Juan remained in his quiet retreat. Quirky fact: a visiting noble once described him as a prince who smiled like a child and bowed to chairs. He meant it as mockery. But maybe Juan just understood more then. They thought and bowed to the only company he ever had. He died young, early 20s. No fanfare, no parade. Just a closed casket and a name that barely echoed in cathedral bells. He was buried with honors, but without legacy. Another branch trimmed before it could twist further. And yet, his life mattered, because Prince Juan is not just a footnote in royal history. He's a warning writ in flesh. A symbol of what happens when family lines are prized more than health. When genetics are ignored in favor of purity. When ceremony replaces care. Historians still debate whether Juan knew he was different. Whether he felt joy. Whether he suffered. The records are too thin, but even in their silence, they paint a picture. A lonely boy, a ceremonial title, and a life quietly lost in the folds of embroidered linen and impossible expectations. You exit the small stone room and look back once more. Not every royal wore a crown. Some wore a quiet, unseen burden born of choices made generations before they ever drew breath. And in the hush of that small chamber, you hear not madness or glory, you hear inheritance. The corridor ahead opens not into a palace, but a war room. Thick maps on the walls. Black and white photographs scattered across a long table, the faces on them all far too familiar. Because now you're stepping into the 20th century where inbreeding didn't just cause hemophilia or failed heirs, it helped ignite a global war. Welcome to the room of cousins at war. Tonight, you meet three monarchs, three rulers who stared across battlefields at one another and saw family. Not metaphorically, literally. First cousins, all descended from Queen Victoria. You already know her legacy, the grandmother of Europe, spreading royal blood like a signature. But by 1914, that legacy turned into something darker, something tragic, because her grandsons were now wearing enemy uniforms. Mainstream historical fact: King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all first cousins. They had played together as children, attended weddings together, signed letters to one another as Nicky, Willie, and Georgie. And yet, when the world tipped into war, those same signatures signed declarations of death. You stand now before three photographs side by side. Uniforms, mustaches, medals nearly identical. In fact, George and Nicholas looked so much alike that people often mistook their photos. But the resemblance wasn't just superficial. It was genetic. Their shared grandmother, Victoria, had passed. Them the same eyes, the same jawline, and through their family trees, a heavy helping of psychological weight and political rigidity. And Wilhelm? He had a clubbed left arm from a traumatic birth, a symbol, some whispered, of the dynasty's bad luck catching up. He grew up feeling inferior, overcompensating with military bravado and nationalist speeches. Historians still debate how much his insecurity shaped Germany's aggression. But one thing's clear: he resented his cousins deeply. You flip through a letter from 1913, Wilhelm to Nicholas. we must remain firm together. Blood binds us beyond all treaties. And a year later, he was declaring war on Russia. Family ties snapped like frayed ribbons. Quirky fact: during the early months of the war, George V reportedly wanted to offer refuge to Nicholas and his family after the Russian Revolution. But when public opinion turned blaming the Tsar for brutality and incompetence, he withdrew the offer. Nicholas was executed less than a year later, shot in a basement with his wife and children, by his cousin's silence as much as by Bolshevik guns. And the irony? It was Queen Victoria's DNA that had helped doom the Romanovs from within hemophilia. In the air, reliance on Rasputin, public unrest, all while her other grandson, George, ruled an island empire across the sea. And Wilhelm? He ended his days in exile, a fallen emperor pruning roses in the Netherlands. Historians still argue how much of World War I was shaped by personal animosity between these rulers, or whether the war machine had already rolled too far. But few deny that the presence of interrelated monarchs made the tensions more entangled, more tragic, and more human. Because this wasn't just a war of trenches and gas masks. It was a war where family betrayal played out on a global scale. You study. A telegram exchange from the eve of war, the so-called Willie-Nicky letters. It reads like a soap opera, if soap operas had bayonets. Nicky, I trust in your wisdom and friendship. Willie, I am moving troops only to protect our borders. Nicky, please do not plunge the world into war. Willie, then stand down first, cousin. Within days, the bombs fell. The letters stopped. Quirky aside. During the war, British newspapers began highlighting the Kaiser's German heritage. He was Queen Victoria's grandson, after all. To distance himself, George V changed the royal family's name from the Germanic Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to something unmistakably English, Windsor. Castles, after all, sound less threatening than cousins with rifles, but the truth was still there. The enemy wore the same blood. You step away from the photographs and into the silent space between them. These weren't just world leaders. They were boys from the same family, raised with the same traditions, told the same myths of blue blood and divine right, and yet completely unprepared for a world exploding into modernity. Because in the end, those castles, those family trees, those carefully preserved bloodlines didn't stop machine guns, didn't stop revolutions, didn't stop the end of empires. By 1918, 2 of the 3 were gone. The Russian Empire, overthrown. The German Empire, collapsed. Only George V remained stoic, tired, monarch of a nation mourning the cost of cousins who forgot they were human first. And so, you step out of this room with the echo of boots on gravel, with the weight of letters unsent, and with one last, cold truth. When you shrink the world into a single family, you don't avoid conflict. You just make war personal. You walk now into a chamber lined with mirrors, not for vanity, but for reflection. Because after war comes reckoning. And tonight, we linger in the last flickers of fading empires, where monarchs tried to modernize the past without letting go of its bones. This is the twilight of inbreeding, where royal houses, exhausted by centuries of cousin matches, finally began to reconsider their rituals, not from clarity, but from collapse. And in the middle of this slow unraveling stands Alfonso XIII of Spain, the last king of Spain before its monarchy dissolved, and then awkwardly reassembled. Alfonso was born in 1886, the posthumous son of King Alfonso XII. He became king the moment he was born, literally, his mother serving as regent until he came of age. He was young, energetic, well-dressed, and liked to race cars. So far, so good. Mainstream historical fact. Alfonso XIII ruled during one of Spain's most turbulent periods: wars in Morocco, unrest at home, the rise of military dictatorship, and eventually exile. But what makes him especially relevant tonight isn't his politics, it's his blood, because Alfonso, like so many of his cousins, married a woman chosen more for her pedigree than her compatibility, Princess Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. Yes, another one. And with that match came hemophilia, carried in Victoria's line. Their firstborn son, Alfonso, inherited it. So did his younger brother, Gonzalo. The dynasty was poisoned from the outset, not by treason or rebellion, but by a gene passed down like an antique bracelet, worn without question. Quirky aside, when the Spanish public learned the heir to the throne had hemophilia, they blamed the queen, who was already unpopular for being foreign and Protestant. Rumors flew that she was a curse, that the marriage was a British plot, that their babies weren't even truly royal. Public support for the monarchy crumbled faster than expected. And Alfonso? He took it personally. Historians still argue whether. His growing authoritarianism in the 1920s was rooted in fear of losing power, of losing his sons, of being the last link in a genetic chain that had snapped. His government slid toward dictatorship, then fledgling reform, then chaos. Eventually, he went into exile in 1931, just as Spain became a republic. His hemophiliac sons died young. His marriage unraveled, and his carefully bred bloodline, it began to thin out, no longer revered, no longer feared, just tragic. You stop beside a glass display where a red sash, a velvet crown, and a tiny silver spoon are preserved. The spoon once belonged to baby Alfonso, the ill-fated heir. It was designed to disguise blood, so attendants wouldn't panic when his gums bled during feeding. That's how far the palace had gone, not to solve the problem, but to hide it in silver. Quirky fact: one of Alfonso's daughters, Infanta Beatriz, broke with tradition entirely and married outside royalty, a commoner. The dynasty didn't love it. But after decades of decay, even they could see the writing on the wall. The bloodline needed fresh air. You move now to the edge of the chamber, where a mirror reflects your tired face and the timeline behind you. It's not pretty. Habsburgs with twisted jaws, Bourbons with failing organs, children who never walked, monarchs who never reigned. It's easy to forget they were human. Easier still to forget they were victims of decisions made by people long dead, because by now you've probably noticed the real pattern. Inbreeding didn't thrive because of ignorance. It thrived because of arrogance, not because for centuries royal families believed their blood was too sacred to mix with anyone else's. They feared impurity more than disease, scandal more than suffering. And so they kept the matches in the family, thinking they could outwit biology with paperwork and prayer. Historians still debate when the true turning point came, when royal families realized they weren't preserving strength, but guaranteeing fragility. Some point to Victoria's descendants, others to Maria of Portugal, others still to the genetic autopsies of the 20th century. But the real answer might be quieter. Maybe it came in a hospital room, where a nurse whispered that the prince wouldn't make it through the night. Maybe it came in a chapel, where a mother lit another candle for a child who didn't respond. Maybe it came in exile, when a king stared into a mirror and realized he'd inherited not just power, but a sentence. You step back from the mirror. Now, and for the first time tonight, you notice something strange, in every chamber, every country, every dynasty. You never saw a photograph of a smiling royal child past age 10. Not one. The corridor narrows here, the light turns amber, and the walls close in, not from architecture, but from memory. You're entering the final centuries of royal inbreeding, when the practice had become less tradition and more taboo, yet still crept through the bloodlines like an echo that refused to fade. This is the domain of Emperor Pedro II of Brazil, a monarch you might not expect in this tale. Far from Europe, across oceans and empires, Pedro's reign offers a glimpse of what happens when the inherited past meets a hopeful future, and how even the best intentions can't always outrun the biology of legacy. Pedro II was born in 1825. The son of Emperor Pedro I and Empress Maria Leopoldina of Austria. His bloodline was unmistakably royal Habsburg on one side, Braganza on the other. Cousins? Certainly. This was, after all, a dynasty built across both Atlantic and ancestral loops. Mainstream historical fact. Pedro II ruled Brazil for over 50 years, becoming one of the most respected monarchs in the Americas. He championed science, literacy, the arts, and eventually the abolition of slavery, which, yes, makes him a serious outlier in royal history. But for all his progressivism, Pedro still lived within the strict traditions of royal breeding. His wife, Teresa Cristina, was also a Bourbon, related to him through various European lines. Their children carried the quiet marks of that gene pool that their son Afonso died at age 2. Their next son, Pedro Afonso, died at 1, both from undiagnosed conditions likely compounded by hereditary weaknesses. The grief was enormous. Pedro never fully recovered. Quirky aside, he kept Pedro Afonso's baby shoes on his writing desk for the rest of his life, little leather reminders of an empire's future cut off before it walked. Pedro's 2 daughters survived. But here's the twist when his daughter Isabel married a French prince, Gaston d'Orleans. Their children did not inherit the throne. The monarchy was overthrown in 1889 and the family exiled. Why? Many in the Brazilian elite didn't want to be ruled by a woman or by a French husband. But behind that excuse was a deeper fear that the tangled royal genes might once again produce heirs unfit for the modern world. Historians still argue whether Brazil's monarchy could have survived if Pedro had been more flexible, allowing his daughter more power, pushing harder for reform, letting go of the old ways. But the tragedy lies deeper. Even with vision, even with progress, even with morality, he couldn't save his own bloodline, because for all his enlightenment, Pedro was still a man born of centuries of inbreeding. His mind soared. His children's bodies did not. You glance now at an embroidered baptismal gown hanging in a case. It was worn by both baby Princess Afonso and Pedro Afonso. Worn, blessed, buried, then unpacked and worn again. The court's quiet hope was always the same. Maybe this time the blood will hold, but it rarely did. Quirky fact. Pedro II was deeply fascinated by Charles Darwin and exchanged letters with him. He donated money to scientific research, funded hospitals, and attended telescope demonstrations. He believed in evolution, in progress, in learning from the past. But when it came to marriage alliances, he followed the same pattern as those who came before him. Because royalty, even the curious kind, rarely unlearned the rituals they were born into. You step into the final display portraits of Pedro in old age. Silver beard, deep eyes, sorrow tucked behind a regal stillness. He died in exile in Paris, heartbroken, holding the memory of children who never lived long enough to read the books he loved. His daughter, Isabel, lived into the 1920s. Her children never ruled. The line faded gently, not from revolt or assassination, but from empty cradles and exhausted blood. Historians still debate whether Pedro II represents the best of monarchy or its final sigh, whether he showed what kings could be or why they were never meant to last. But as you leave this golden lit room behind, you realize something quiet and sad. Even the good ones couldn't escape the damage done long before they were born. Even the ones who saw the future carried too much of the past. You enter a hushed rotunda, now vaulted ceiling above, walls lined with family trees that spiral out in silver thread and then curl back in. This is no ordinary gallery. It's a room of loops, and every loop tells the same story: ambition. Married repetition. Welcome to the Habsburg pedigree room, where the walls aren't decorated with art, but with genealogical RECURSION at the center. A single massive chart dominates the space. You step closer, eyes following names that repeat, intertwine, and return again like the chorus of a haunting lullaby. Charles, Ferdinand, Maria, Philip, over and over again, not as descendants, but as remixes of the same blood. This is where the Habsburgs become mainstream historical fact. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, he had more duplicate ancestors than unique ones. In fact, if you go back just 5 generations, he had only 32 unique individuals in a tree that should have had 64. That's a level of inbreeding known as pedigree collapse. And it's not just a footnote, it's a genetic red flag. Historians still argue about how to interpret the numerical nightmare of the Habsburg family tree. Was it a calculated risk to keep lands consolidated? A desperate bid to preserve Catholic unity? Or just willful denial cloaked in ceremony and lace? Either way, the consequences weren't just medical. They were existential. You run a finger along the looping names and notice something strange. By the time you reach the mid-17th century, entire branches fold back into themselves. Cousins marrying cousins wasn't the exception. It was the only option left. Quirky aside, in one generation, Philip IV of Spain married his niece, Mariana of Austria, to produce Charles II. But Mariana was also the daughter of his sister, and the granddaughter of his aunt, and the cousin of his previous wife. You'd need a whiteboard, a compass, and maybe divine patience to even sketch it accurately. And no, it wasn't romantic. It was strategic stagnation, and the empire paid the price. Here's where it gets chilling. Geneticists who analyzed Charles II's ancestry estimate that his inbreeding coefficient, basically the percentage chance he inherited the same gene from both parents, was over 25%, about the same as a child of sibling parents. Let that sink in. You pause beside a marble bust of Charles, jaw frozen mid-twist, eyes carved blank. We've met him before, but now, in the heart of this genetic maze, his presence feels different, less tragic, more inevitable. Quirky fact: modern simulations of the Habsburg tree reveal that by the end of their line, the average heir was more closely related to themselves than to their own siblings. Royal solitude elevated to a molecular level. Even so, they kept going, because no matter how crooked the tree grew, no matter how many branches snapped in the cradle, the palace refused to plant anything new. Marry a cousin, seal the border. Wed a niece, unite the crown. No one paused to ask what happened after the wedding, when babies didn't cry, or limbs twisted inward, or minds never quite cleared. Historians still debate whether the Habsburgs believed God would preserve them, no matter how bent their genetics became. Perhaps they thought divine right could override recessive alleles. Or perhaps they simply couldn't imagine being ordinary. But nature, patient and relentless, doesn't care about thrones. You glance back at the chart, and the lines no longer look like a tree. They look like a spiral, curling inward, tighter and tighter, until nothing can grow anymore. That's the lesson of this room, not the horror of deformity, not the drama of dynasties, but the mathematics of arrogance. Because when power closes itself off, Convinced of its own perfection, it doesn't just weaken. It vanishes, one loop at a time. You descend a narrow staircase, now stone steps worn by time, echoing softly as if the past itself is whispering. Down here, the air cools, the light dims, and the walls lean in. Because this is the hidden level, where dynasties don't just end, they unravel. Welcome to the last heirs. The final flickers of royal bloodlines that had burned too long, too close, and too inward. And nowhere is that fading light clearer than in Portugal. Mainstream historical fact. The House of Braganza ruled Portugal for centuries, navigating empire, colonization, and conflict. But by the late 1800s, the line had thinned literally and politically. A series of strategic cousin marriages had left their family tree more stump than forest. And by the time King Carlos I came to power, the cracks were not just visible, they were hemorrhaging. Carlos, tall and regal, with a massive mustache and a love of painting and oceanography, might have seemed like a modern monarch. But his family's blood carried the same quiet burdens: neurological fragility, emotional volatility, and a body politic deeply resentful of its leaders. And his heir, Prince Luis Felipe, had the weight of generations on him, both genetically and symbolically. Historians still debate the depth of damage within the Braganza line. Was it mental illness? Subtle cognitive decline? Simply bad leadership? What's undeniable is that the royal family had become distant, brittle, and eerily fragile, both in their veins and in their policies. Then came the Lisbon regicide. On February 1st, 1908, King Carlos and his son Luis Felipe were riding in an open carriage when two assassins opened fire. Within seconds, both were dead shot before the crowd, blood on cobblestones. The monarchy and the bloodline shattered on the street. Quirky aside, the assassins were part of the Carbonaria, a secret anti-monarchist group. Their weapon? Guns. Yes, but also pamphlets detailing the royal family's degeneracy due to centuries of inbreeding. It wasn't just a political assassination, it was a biological reckoning. The only survivor was Manuel II, Carlos's younger son. He was 18, unprepared, emotionally shattered, and biologically. He was the last Braganza. He ruled for just 2 years. In 1910, revolution erupted. The monarchy was abolished, and Manuel fled into exile, first to Gibraltar, then England. He never returned to power. He never married royally. He had no legitimate children. He died in 1932 of a throat infection. And just like that, the Braganza dynasty, one of the oldest royal houses in Europe, was extinct. You move toward a cracked leather chair in the corner of the room. It's the one Manuel reportedly sat in during his final days, reading, coughing, dictating letters in faded ink. There's a blanket over the back, monogrammed with a royal seal that meant everything once and nothing now. Quirky fact: in his exile, Manuel collected Portuguese books and tried to archive the history of his country. He became a curator of his own extinction. Gentle, quiet, almost apologetic for being royal at all. And the irony? Some distant relatives still claim ties to the throne today. They have websites, coat of arms graphics, claims. But the blood? The original line? It stopped. Historians still argue whether Manuel II should be mourned or simply understood as the PM. Final echo of an outdated system. A man both innocent and complicit. A symbol not of glory, but of decay. Because when the foundation is too narrow, too repeated, too afraid of difference, it can't hold. Not against revolution, not against bullets, not even against the flu. And so you sit quietly in this stone-walled crypt of memory and realize some royal lines didn't end in grand wars or dramatic betrayals. Some just tapered into silence, undone by their own DNA, one fading heir at a time. You emerge from the crypt-like quiet into a room that feels different, not majestic, not tragic, but clinical. Glass cases, medical drawings, and silence, not the reverent kind, but the kind you hear in hospital corridors at 3 a.m. This is the science room, where centuries of superstition and ceremony finally face the cold, fluorescent truth of modern genetics. Tonight, the crown jewels are microscopes. Mainstream historical fact. In the 20th century, as monarchies fell and bloodlines blurred, scientists began to ask questions that had lingered in whispers. Why did so many royal children die young? Why the twisted jaws, the seizures, the infertility? And why did these issues cluster so tightly inside royal pedigrees? Enter genetics. In 2009, a team of scientists used genealogical and medical records to study Charles II of Spain. Their conclusion? His inbreeding coefficient was higher than that of the offspring of siblings. Not metaphorically, mathematically. It explained his misshapen skull, his cognitive impairment, his inability to chew, to speak clearly, to father children. It wasn't God's will. It wasn't a family curse. It was biology. Cold and cumulative. Historians still argue whether this kind of retroactive diagnosis is fair, whether we're projecting modern science onto people who had no concept of DNA. But the evidence is hard to ignore. The pattern wasn't just there. It was repeating, escalating, and unavoidable. Quirky aside, hemophilia, famously called the royal disease, was traced back to Queen Victoria, who likely carried the gene due to a spontaneous mutation. From her, it passed through 3 royal families: British, Russian, and Spanish. The Romanovs' hemophiliac heir, Alexei, helped fuel the mystique around Rasputin. In a strange way, one faulty chromosome helped end the Russian Empire. But genetics didn't just explain the past. It changed the future. By the mid-20th century, royal families had begun genetic counseling. Matches were still arranged, but now, quietly, family trees were checked for risk. Marriage between close relatives, once noble, became awkward. Even scandalous. Suddenly, marrying a distant noble or even a commoner wasn't just progressive. It was medically strategic. You pause in front of a framed letter from a European palace physician in the 1970s. It reads, in elegant script, "The risk is high. The line must diversify. This match cannot proceed." The language is gentle. The message is brutal. And here's where modern royals enter. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were third cousins through Queen Victoria, but also second cousins once removed through Christian IX of Denmark. That's still pretty close. But their children? Married further out. Diana Spencer wasn't royal. Kate Middleton wasn't noble. Meghan Markle, American, biracial, divorced. To some royalists, that's erosion. To a geneticist, that's progress. Quirky. Fact, in the 2000s, the Spanish royal family allowed a team to map their medical history, not for PR, but because they genuinely wanted to understand the effects of centuries of inbreeding. The results weren't published, but one researcher, off the record, called the findings sobering. You step toward a final display, a family tree rendered not in names, but in chromosomes. The lines aren't elegant scrolls, they're tangled webs. Some broken, some tight like knots, and some finally reaching outward again, away from the loops. Historians still debate whether modern monarchies are meaningful anymore, whether they're symbols, relics, celebrities, or liabilities. But one thing's clear, they're no longer. Genetic experiments today. A royal child is more likely to inherit brown bread and common colds than hemophilia and jaw disorders. And that, frankly, is a good thing, because science didn't just explain the collapse. It helped stop it. And you, standing here, watching the past unravel under glass, can almost feel the palace walls exhale centuries of pressure, finally relieved. No more cousin charts. No more ceremonial silence when the baby doesn't cry. No more crowns made of bone and burden. Just a chance, small, quiet, miraculous, for something healthier to begin. The room you're in now feels quieter than the rest, not because it's empty, but because it's done whispering. The displays are fewer, the lighting softer. There are no more looping family trees, no more death masks or painted portraits with eyes that seem too wide for their frames. This is the reckoning room, where history stops performing and simply sits with itself. Tonight, you rest here, alongside the slow, exhausted breath of royal bloodlines that finally ran out of places to hide. Mainstream historical fact. By the 21st century, inbreeding among European royal families had largely ceased. Dynasties that once insisted on noble-only matches were now quietly celebrating marriages to journalists, actors, and commoners with no claim to land or title. Why? Not just for love, but because the alternative was collapse. And collapse, as you've seen tonight, doesn't always mean revolution. Sometimes it's just too many funerals for infants who never spoke. You stopped before a photograph, black and white, grainy, of a young Prince John, the youngest son of King George V. He had epilepsy, likely autism, possibly other undiagnosed conditions. He was hidden away in a country house for most of his life, rarely mentioned in public. Died at 13. No official diagnosis. No discussion of causes. But the bloodline? Still the same, quirky aside. Prince John was called Johnny the Ghost by palace staff. His siblings weren't allowed to speak of him in public. Even decades later, royal archives kept his records sealed longer than others. The shame? Less about him and more about what he symbolized. Historians still argue whether that silence was cruelty or kindness, whether hiding illness was protection or punishment. But the pattern was old and familiar, and always polite, because even when the bodies failed, the pageantry did not. You trace your eyes across a modern wedding photo now. The Duchess of Cambridge in white silk. A crowd of thousands, headlines about love, legacy, and lineage. But the real miracle that day wasn't the dress. It was that the bride and groom weren't second cousins. You pass by a glass case with no artifacts, just light, soft and golden, empty, and yet peaceful, because the story is finally shifting, not erasing, not rewriting, but acknowledging that royal blood, however gilded, is still just blood. And for all the castles and crowns, what survives isn't always the name or the throne. Sometimes it's simply the lesson. You glance at the final wall, where long quote wraps in delicate script. We married for politics. We married for power. We married our cousins. And in doing so, we nearly disappeared. Ourselves. Beneath it, a plaque reads, "Extinction is not always violent. Sometimes it's hereditary." And somehow, that lands harder than any guillotine. Quirky fact? In a genetic study comparing modern European royals with the general population, it turns out the average royal today is less inbred than a random European peasant from the 1700s. The irony? Royals finally mixed out just as their relevance faded. Historians still debate whether monarchy has any place left in the world, but no one argues the biology anymore. The science is settled, and so, too, is the blood. You walk toward the final doorway where no guards stand, no velvet rope blocks your path. Just a quiet corridor that stretches beyond this story, Beyond palaces and pedigrees and problems made in cradles. It's the future. And for the first time tonight, it feels open. You've reached the end of the exhibit now, but instead of a grand finale, you're met with stillness. The kind that settles in old houses after midnight. The kind that echoes more than it sounds. This is not the crescendo of a king's coronation, or the crash of a falling empire. No, this is the gentle hush of history, finally taking off its crown and whispering, "That's enough." Mainstream historical fact. The last major European monarch to rule with absolute power was Franz Joseph I of Austria, whose long, stubborn reign dragged through wars, heartbreaks, and loss. When he died in 1916, he was buried beneath Vienna in the imperial crypt next to dozens of relatives, many of whom had also suffered under the family's twisted family tree. You pause by a sculpture of him, hands folded, expression weary. Not proud, not regal, just tired. He ruled nearly 70 years through more funerals than weddings, watching his empire and his gene pool disintegrate around him. And yet, even as Europe cracked open, royal households were still hosting formal dinners, still signing marriage contracts between second cousins once removed, as if tradition could plug a hole in the hull of a sinking ship. Quirky aside, at Franz Joseph's funeral, the Habsburgs performed their ancient ritual. A herald knocked on the crypt door and listed the emperor's titles: ruler of this, lord of that. Silence. Knocked again, listing fewer titles. Still silence. Third knock. Franz Joseph, a mortal and sinful man. Only then were the doors opened. It took 3 tries to let a king be human. Historians still argue whether Europe's royal dynasties ever truly understood the damage they inflicted, not through war or taxes, but through the insistence that blood must be sacred, even when it wasn't healthy. And now, here you are. You've walked with them, dined at their gilded tables, peeked into their cradles, and closed their tombs. You've seen how power can turn inward, how fear of outside blood can breed its own extinction, and how sometimes the softest fall is the hardest to stop. But there's peace in this, too. Because now you know the truth. And the truth is not cruel, it's simply tired. Just like they were. You step through the last doorway, and ahead of you is nothing but a long corridor of quiet. No music, no guards. Just the echo of footsteps and soft shoes and the faint sense that maybe, just maybe, someone's finally asleep behind those palace walls. You made it. You survived the crowns, the cousins, and the consequences. You survived the pageantry, the powdered wigs, the looping lines of lost sons and bent spines, and weddings that were more treaties than promises. And now we slow everything down. You find yourself in a still room now, where the lights grow warmer and the air feels settled. Imagine, just for a moment, an empty throne in a quiet hall, dust motes drifting in sunbeams. No footsteps echoing, no ceremonies waiting. Just silence. That's what remains after all the titles, after all the heirs, after all the weddings that looped back into themselves. The names fade, the bloodline thins, and what's left isn't a curse or a crown, but a whisper of what happens when power tries to control nature for too long. Take a slow breath. Now let your shoulders drop a little more, and picture one final cradle in a forgotten wing of a long empty palace. The baby inside is asleep, the nameplate polished, the blood quiet. There's no nurse waiting, no physician charting, just the soft creak of wind against the shutters. That's the ending, no. One writes into the royal records, but it's the one that always comes. You've walked through centuries tonight, drifted past ghosts in embroidered robes, and learned that even the most gilded stories eventually fade. So rest now, knowing the tale is told. You don't need to remember the dates. You don't need to memorize the names. Just know that history, like you, sometimes just wants to lie down and close its eyes. Sleep well.